This was my very first apartment, and I was so excited to be in it. My freshman year, I lived in a dorm on campus, and before that, I lived at home with my mom, so I had never lived on my own before. The apartment was a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom that I shared with a friend I had known since we were 13. I had just turned 20 when all this happened. His name was Josh. Josh was my absolute best friend, and it was his first year at the university, so naturally I was like, I'll show you around. And we did pretty much everything together. Fast forward to the homecoming football game. We attend a university that's crazy into football, and we're actually a pretty good team. So the homecoming game is a big deal to everyone. Josh was so excited to go out because it was his first homecoming game. He was going to go with this boy that he had started flirting with, and he wanted me to come along. I don't really remember why I didn't want to go, I just didn't. Josh got mad at me. We said dumb stuff to each other and he laughed. So I was alone for the rest of the night. I had and still do have a small dog named Poppy who lived with us. She was around a year old at the time. We actually had a pretty relaxing night in the beginning. I took a shower, put on a face mask, and Poppy and I watched TV in bed and stuff. I remember listening to a song on repeat the entire day, because that's what I do when I find a new song that I like. To this day, I still can't listen to it without being reminded. We went to sleep at around 10 p.m. I think. I wasn't keeping up with what was going on with the football game, so I really have no idea if it was just ending or whatever. But I knew not to expect Josh home early because he was going out with the guy that he was seeing, Dylan, afterwards. There is a strip of bars along one of the main roads running towards campus, and that's where they would be. That's where everyone would be after the game ended. I don't know what time it was, but I woke to cabinets being slammed and really loud noises. It was really dark in my room, and the only thing I could see was that the kitchen lights were on. I saw the light coming through the bottom of the door. It sounded like people were going through our kitchen cabinets one by one. Poppy was at the edge of the bed, barking like a crazy dog. I had never seen her act this way. I was struggling to keep myself awake because I'm a really heavy sleeper. Not anymore. And I just knew that it wasn't Josh and Dylan. But some stupid part of me decided to call out. Hello? But it was weak sounding and I really don't know if they heard me or not. Suddenly, my bedroom door opened. I shot up. Poppy was snarling and trying to lunge at the stranger in my bedroom. I couldn't see anything because the light from the open door was blinding me. I just saw his figure. He was wearing a hoodie and just stood there for maybe 15 seconds, and I was just staring at him. The whole time, Poppy was trying to mess him up. He quickly closed my door, and I don't know why, I just didn't move. I wanted to move, but I couldn't. And then my door flings open a second time, and we're staring face to face again, for the same painfully long amount of time. My heart was racing, and I remember thinking, he's going to hurt me. Now that I look back, I should have screamed or something. Poppy was at the very edge of the bed now, vicious and snarling. She sounded like a big dog, honestly. And then he slammed my door shut. As soon as he did, I jumped out of bed and I locked my door. I heard them take my car keys. I was terrified they would find my car and steal it, since I had just parked directly outside. I frantically called 911 and was sobbing the whole time. I said, "Someone is in my house and they came in my room, please help." And it took them about 30 minutes to get there. When I know that there were cop cars everywhere surrounding the bar since it was homecoming, which I live about a 5-minute drive from. When I finally came out, the living room and my roommate's bedroom was completely ransacked. My roommate's TV was on the floor because they had tried to carry it out, but I guess decided to just leave it. They stole my Xbox and all my games, They stole my book bag with my textbooks and my homework in it. The two policemen got there and I told them everything and asked if I could call my roommate. Josh picked up the phone but was heavily slurring, and I could tell that he was inside of a bar and he could barely hear me. I just screamed, "Please give Dylan the phone," hoping that Dylan was at least more sober than Josh was. So Josh put Dylan on the phone, and I don't know how, through my tears and sobs and through the screaming people and house music, but he heard me say that our apartment was robbed. He frantically said, "We're coming," and he hung up. They probably ran. While I was waiting for them, one of the policemen asked if he could try to take prints from my roommate's TV, and I agreed. He proceeds to then drop his flashlight directly on the screen, and as it shattered, he just looked at me. I'm like, really? So then Josh and Dylan get back, and the policemen totally change their tone. They get aggressive and say that we were targeted for a reason. I'm pretty sure that since it was homecoming, the robbers were not expecting me to be there, and were trying to just rob apartments blindly. We also lived on the ground floor, so it's easier to get in those than in 2-story and 3-story apartments. Josh is in the military, but Josh looks just like any other regular college freshman boy, and his only friends at the time were literally me and Dylan, so we were the only ones who knew that he was in the military. They tried to accuse Josh of stashing guns and drugs everywhere, and that's why we got robbed. I literally was like, "Are you kidding me?" Then they tried to pull me aside and say that Josh had hired people to come rob his own apartment while I was inside. They asked me, "How do you know these guys?" I said, "Sir, I've known Josh since I was 13. We moved here together to attend university together." He just gave me a look. When they left, we got our locks immediately changed and then had to take the next day off of school to drive to the nearest Nissan dealership, 30 minutes away, and then wait 7 hours for them to rewire a key fob for me. To the men who robbed me, let's not meet again, for your sake, because I'm older and angry and have defensive weapons now, and won't be afraid to kick your butt. And to the cops who accused my roommate of robbing his own apartment, let's not meet again, and I hope that you got fired because, yes, I did report you both. I used to live in a real rough area. I'm talking super low-income apartment complex in southeastern Tennessee that had been raided by the DTF, a local police thing, the Drug Task Force, and cleared out multiple times in the past. The apartment complex is pretty spread out with a lot of roads linking them all together. This place was almost like a small village, I guess, because most people in the complex would wander around outside, or sit outside their apartment and just socialize, or do shady stuff. Lots of small meth labs, dealers, that sort of thing. I didn't tend to have a lot of problems because, as a former addict myself, I didn't tend to be the snitching or moralizing sort. As long as whatever stuff you were up to didn't impact or involve me, I couldn't give a crap as long as nobody was getting actively harmed. So, that's who I was. The quiet guy who lived with his, at the time, in a totally different, much healthier relationship now. Boyfriend and 4 cats who didn't mess with anybody. But on the few instances I had been messed with, I had been known not to back down, so I wasn't often. Keyword often. It did absolutely happen from time to time, obviously messed with. People also didn't tend to start stuff with each other there. Mostly just outsiders, and while I didn't make friends, I was at least a known member of the community as I lived there for about 2 years. I didn't have the option to move out. I was poor as hell, and between me and my ex, I was the only one working. I was able to keep us and the cats fed and the bills paid, but that was literally it. And sometimes I struggle to do that, at least the bills part. I can't say any of us ever went hungry, even if what we were eating was very low bar. I drove a beat-up old 2001 Jeep Grand Cherokee at the time. This was the sort of vehicle that every time you got in, it turned the key, you would usher a small silent prayer to gods that you didn't believe in, hoping this wouldn't be the day that it finally stopped starting. The vehicles had a ton of problems, some of which I managed to fix on my own, others not so much. That said, it was my lifeline. The only way I had to get to work. Public transportation was very expensive in my town, as it was in a ruralish area with not many options in the first place, and other places. I'm not quite sure how this happened, but somehow, word got out that I was trying to sell my Jeep. This obviously wasn't true because I needed the thing and knew it wasn't worth enough to sell in order to assure that I could buy another vehicle. Nonetheless, I started having people approach me about it, offering me painfully low sums of money, like $100 and stuff like that. Before that, I would turn them away. I tried my damnedest to kill the for sale rumor, but it persisted up until the day that I moved out of the state and never looked back. So, one night toward the end of my tenure at the complex, after me and my ex had split and he had moved out, I was alone and gaming on my PC. I believe I was playing Tekken. I heard a loud, frantic series of knocks at my front door. These apartments were small and crappy, so it was within visible eyesight, the door of my bed in the bedroom, and this dude was knocking loudly. I get up, already sketched out because of the hour, grabbed a knife that I had, and I looked through the people. I couldn't really see anything because it was so dark, so I talked through the door. I asked who it was and what they wanted, in a commanding, almost aggressive tone because I wasn't trying to look vulnerable. For reference, I'm just under 6 foot, around 220 pounds and by no means small or weak. That said, I'm also not a one-man army or some kind of substantial badass. I'm as human as anyone else, and while I'm not one to run away from a fight, I'm not the idiot sort to run toward them. At least not anymore either. I heard nothing at first, so I asked again. Nothing again. I stood there trying to listen for a few minutes before returning to the bedroom, and a few minutes later, I heard the knocking start once again. This time, I went to my window to see if I could see anyone outside at all, and I saw several shadows lurking in my Jeep parked just outside. Now at this point, I was worried they were going to try to break into it. It would be really easy considering the back window was out and covered by tape and bags, or steal it. So this time, I actually opened the door. Standing in the little alley hallway thing in front of my door was a group of 3 individuals. The complex had 4 doors in each building, but I lived alone in that unit, and it was the last unit on the hill before hitting grass and a hill. So the thought that somebody nearby might join up with me if the shit hit the fan was non-existent, so I was very on edge. I only recognized one who was standing in front of the other 2. I had seen him around the complex and I knew where he lived. I'm still packing the knife, but I'm not brandishing it at this point. I ask again what he wants and what the hell these people are doing knocking on my door at 1 a.m. and lingering around my Jeep. He said that he had heard it was for sale and wanted to come buy it, offering me the pitiful amount of money he had on him. It was legitimately like $30 for it, and said him and his boys were just checking it out. I told him that 1, the Jeep isn't for sale despite what he had heard, and 2, even if it was, I wouldn't sell it for $30. As you can probably predict, he wasn't happy about this answer. I could tell this dude was bombed. He had all the telltale signs of drug influence going on, and just generally had that look about him. Scabs, twitchy, malnourished with hardly any body fat, bloodshot eyes with constricted pupils, the whole shebang. He mouthed off something at me which was so slurred and accented that I couldn't really understand it. I didn't respond, just kept staring him down before eventually telling him to please F off. After hearing this, he gestured for his bodies to come over, and now I had 3 people standing shoulder to shoulder in the hallway, leading up to my door doing their best intimidation stances, before the guy asked in a real messed up tone, "You sure about that, boy?" Before I said, "Yes, I am," after which I revealed the knife and ejected the blade from the handle. This was a larger knife with full knuckle guards and a spike in the bottom. Not your typical small pocket knife by any means. His response to this was to call me a baby for bringing out a weapon, to which I responded something of the lines of saying, "The dude who came here 3 deep," in which he laughed at. The sight of the knife didn't put him off at all. I guess he figured I'd be too scared to use it, or that they could rush me before I got the chance. When I saw them inching their way forward, I sprung into action and started wildly thrusting and slashing the blade around in their general direction with wild abandon, showing that I had 0 issues with potentially killing or injuring one of them. I knew that I was unlikely to win a 3-on-1 fight, even with the knife, but I made it clear that if I was going down, I was taking at least one of them with me. They backed up and started talking to me, calling me bad things and other choice words, but I kept moving toward them as they backed up, showing that at this point, they were either going to leave or someone was going to get stabbed. By the time I got to the end of the hallway, to the lot where my Jeep was parked, I noticed 2 more people standing by the Jeep, and internally swore at myself for just not going back inside, but I was in too deep now. At this point, I went all in and started yelling at the top of my lungs, acting like a bloodthirsty lunatic who was just out to hurt people, in a similar manner to how people try to scare bears away. I was just trying to be as loud and as threatening as possible, to really sell the idea that even if they took me out, at least one of them might end up dead as a result. And to be honest, I fully intended it for it to go that way if the shit popped off. One of the guys by my Jeep then brandished what looked to be, too dark to tell, a piece of wood at me as a threat, to which I had a quick wit to respond to by saying, "Swing that at me and I'll shove this knife so far up your butt that you'll wish you brought a better weapon," which I remember specifically because one of the other guys thought that was the funniest stuff in the world and started laughing. Not in a "you won't do it" sort of way, but in a manner that seemed like I was really entertaining him. I was so hyped on adrenaline that my response to this was to slash at him, as he was one of the closer ones to me, at which he swore at me before running off, and all the rest followed suit. After this, I went back inside and stayed awake until sunrise, to assure they didn't come back before finally falling asleep on the couch by the door, so I could hear if anything else happened outside, and hopefully wake up if it did. Nothing more happened, and the next day, after I saw the guy who had initialized the standoff with me as I was getting home from work, he followed me up to my apartment where I parked and apologized for what had happened. He said that he was high at the time and also drunk, so he was feeling extra stupid. I told him that it wasn't a big deal. It's sad how commonplace stuff like this could be in the complex, even if most of them tended not to mess with their own. We had enough people passing through to assure that it happened normally. Not everyone followed the unspoken rule of not messing with the other residents, and not to do it again. He then quickly approached me and hugged me in this real bro sort of manner. I went along with it and told him to have a nice day before going back inside and settling down. There were no more incidents with him or his buddies ever again after this, though it wasn't the last time that stuff popped off there involving me before I moved. Just the last and only time with this guy and his friends. Even though I played it off as not caring, it was mostly just to avoid further conflict. So, to the whacked out meth head and his friends who decided it was in their best interest to intimidate me into selling my vehicle for like $30, once definitely not ever meet again. I've been debating if I wanted to post this story because it was really unnerving. However, with all this quarantine going on, I figured that I might as well share this story in order to kill some time. For the past 2 years, I've been working at a haunted house attraction. It's a really fun gig, but the job tends to attract some rather creepy individuals. For the 2 years that I've worked there has always been some kind of creep that works there. I have another post that recounts the first year's scary incident. It's still up there if you want to check it out. This post in particular will recount my second year's creepy incident. I'll start this story with orientation day. This is where we meet all the other fellow actors and choose our roles. When I had walked into the building, my heart fell to the pit of my stomach. A man who looked like the same creeper from my first year at the haunted house was waiting for orientation to start. But I knew that it couldn't possibly be the same man, because the man from my first year had ended himself months ago. And to make matters even stranger, this man even had the same name, Daniel. So at first I thought this was all a wild coincidence. There's no way this man will also turn out to be a creep. Boy, was I wrong. Allow me to describe Daniel. He was a man probably in his late 40s or early 50s. He was a short and pudgy man. From the beginning, everyone could kind of tell that he was a little socially awkward, and there's nothing wrong with that. But he really did kind of creep out most of the workers. Additionally, he couldn't drive, so he was either super early to work or super late, and he was usually the last to leave. So overall, he was a peculiar fellow. But hey, we're all working at a peculiar job. Orientation came and went and without any issues, and soon the attraction had started. To understand the story, let me explain where I was located in the attraction. I was located in a large maze outside of the main house with about 5 other guys, including Daniel. These 5 guys were scattered throughout the maze, and I was at the center of it in a large rectangular room. The room was enclosed, unlike the rest of the maze, and had 2 exits. All of the guys besides Daniel were around my age, which was 18. Honestly, I don't even know whose brilliant idea it was to put a lone girl in a large maze with 5 guys. Thankfully, I was somewhat friends with one of the guys, so I didn't feel too alone. However, this friend was located at the tail end of the maze. Daniel was located decently close to my room, but that didn't bother me at first. There was no reason for Daniel or any of the other guys to enter my room. They all had their own positions to handle. One other thing to understand about this maze is that all of the actors were still able to see one another, because the walls in the maze were relatively short. So despite being far away from my friend, I was still able to see him. Now I hope that I explained that clearly. Nothing strange occurred the first 2 nights, but on the 3rd night, Daniel made his move. When no customers were going through the attraction, the actors would just walk around the maze or sit on the ground to relax. During these times, I would leave my room and either sit on the ground somewhere or enter the main house to grab a bottle of water. In order to enter the main house, I would have to go through the maze and pass Daniel's area. The first few times that I did this, Daniel said nothing and would just watch me. On the 3rd day, he finally mustered up the courage to say, "Hey, how are you?" Not thinking anything of it, I happily replied and carried on to fetch a water bottle. From then on, anytime I passed him, he always had some comment. It was harmless things at first, like, "You're really good. The weather's nice out here. You're a pretty scary actor." So other than him always having something to say, I really didn't think too much of it. Days continued on and Daniel kept getting a little braver. In between breaks, he would awkwardly walk towards the center of the maze. He moved really slowly, like he was trying to be stealthy. My only saving grace was that before he could reach my room, a group of customers would begin to approach and he would have to run back to his position. This is when alarm bells began to ring. I knew that there was no reason for Daniel to leave his position and come to mine. Now, whenever I saw that he was motioning towards my room, I would go out the other direction in hopes to put more distance between us. It didn't help that he was dressed in a scary costume and wearing a mask. This only added to the tension. On the times where I chose to sit on the ground and wait for customers, Daniel would go through the maze and stand where a single wall separated us. Looking back, I should have just walked away, but I didn't want to come off as a rude, punk-ass teenager. This is when he introduced himself, even though we already did that on orientation day. Trying to play nice, I introduced myself and we shook hands, and then he said the words that I will never forget. "You're beautiful." This caught me so off guard that all I could say was, "I'm sorry." He then repeated himself and kept his gaze locked on me. I very awkwardly replied, "Thanks," and refused to make eye contact with him. Keep in mind, I'm an 18-year-old girl and he's a man in his 40s. I'm also covered in sweat, mud, and fake blood. Thoroughly creeped out, I was now determined to avoid him at all costs. Whenever we had breaks, I now went through the maze in the opposite direction of Daniel in order to get to the main house. It was a longer way, but it was worth it. Daniel soon noticed this and now put more of an effort in walking towards my room between breaks. There were several times where he actually entered the room, but thankfully, I had the wits to leave the room entirely and go stand where my friend was. Daniel would just stand in my room, look around, and one time, he sat down on the floor. It was actually comical sometimes to see him standing in my room, realize that customers were coming, and then rush out of there and back into his position. Sadly, with how dark the maze was, I couldn't always keep a sharp eye on Daniel's whereabouts. There was one incident where he approached me unexpectedly and said, "I like the way you scream." One of my lines that I said in the attraction to customers was, "You can't leave me, I need you." And Daniel just absolutely ate that up and loved it. Well, you can bet after he said that he liked that line, I stopped using it. I had to endure a month of this, but over time, Daniel got the message that I was not interested. In retaliation, he began to steal my scare points. There were certain areas, scare points near my room, that I would pop out and scare customers. These scare points were accessible to the other actors, but no one else used them but me. I suppose Daniel was mad that I wasn't giving him any attention, so he decided to steal my scare points as revenge. He also began to copy some of my lines. Thankfully, towards the end of the haunt season, the managers of the attraction moved me inside the main house. I'm not sure why, because I didn't say anything to them about Daniel, even though I know I should have. So for the final days of working there, I was nowhere near Daniel. When the season ended, I was relieved. However, the managers had the bright idea to open a Christmas-themed haunted house, and they asked me to work it out. I loved the job and didn't plan on having a creep ruin it for me. Although many actors from the Halloween season didn't return for the Christmas attraction, Daniel was not one of them. He was there, and boy was he thrilled to see that I had returned as well. This time, however, I convinced my best friend to work there. So with my best friend being there, she sort of acted as a deterrent for Daniel. Throughout the whole season, he never approached me. Well, that was until the final night. My friend and I were chilling in one of the rooms and waiting on customers. This room was the first room in the attraction, so everyone else was passing through in order to get to their positions. Daniel began to pass through, and then suddenly turned back around to face my friend and me, again with those beady, never blinking eyes, and he said, "I think you two are beautiful." I just cringed and looked away as my friend shyly replied, "Thank you." So overall, Daniel is pretty creepy, but I suspect that maybe he doesn't know what he's doing is wrong. I don't think he really realizes that flirting with young girls and trying to be in a room alone with them is okay. I caught word that there might be something wrong with him, but I don't know for sure. But the feeling of dread I had in that maze is a feeling I will never forget. In retrospect, I really should have told someone. I kept telling myself that if Daniel did one more thing or tried to enter my room again, that I would tell the managers. One thing that I can think of that at least lightens the mood is that his costume was literally a tree man. His mask was just a tree with a contorted, scary face. When customers would walk by, they would all shout, "Look, it's Groot." It got a good laugh out of me every time. If I explain the story poorly, I'm sorry, and please ask anything if you're confused. So Daniel, maybe you're just looking for love, but you're looking in the wrong places, man. I'm assuming that I will see you again this coming season, and if I do, please stay away from me. This happened over a decade ago, but I only recently found this sub and I think it's a good fit. It was Halloween of 2008. I was in college and still in a relationship with my first serious boyfriend. We had been together since high school, and it took this night to show me our relationship was abusive. It took one more incident before I finally left him for good. He was wonderful when sober, if intense and controlling, but when he was drunk, I learned that he was truly terrifying. This was the first such incident that truly scared me. He had joined in a stupid game, a Gatorade and Shine challenge. They would empty a bottle of Gatorade at least halfway, fill the rest up with moonshine. The goal was to finish the bottle within an hour and to have them tell crazy stories. When he completed the challenge, but he never did tell his friends the story. He couldn't remember most of it, and it painted him in a horrific light. He knew things were heading downhill when he started calling me bad names, after saying hi to a guy friend at a party that we were at. I decided that we had better head home before he got any worse. I thought that I could nip it in the bud and manage it. We got home and changed out of our costumes. James wanted to have sex, but in his state, and after what he had called me, I wasn't interested. Oddly enough, it led to him calling me more names. I left the apartment to go smoke. Our neighbors were having a party and two guys were outside smoking as well. They came over to see if I was okay. I had been crying and they had heard the yelling. I said I was, which they could obviously see was a lie. They let me know if I needed help, that they would help me. And James chose that moment to come outside. Said that he had heard us and told them to get away from me, stalking towards them. I stood up to get between them. They told me that they had meant what they said and to not forget it, and then told him to watch himself. I was facing them to say bye and thanks for the other when one of the guys gasped, staring at my boyfriend in shock. I turned around and my eyes immediately caught on the ground. Just as what I was seeing registered, the other guy lunged forward and grabbed me, pulling me behind him. What was on the ground that had elicited such reactions, you might ask? Blood. Blood was dripping on the ground from his hand. He was holding a knife so tightly that he had sliced his own hand open. I begged him to drop it, which he only agreed to when I walked back towards him. I was an idiot, I know. The two guys seemed at a loss, and I feel so bad for them having their Halloween ruined by this scary, crazy stuff. They left me to it after I swore that I'd be fine, reiterating that I could come to them for help. We got inside and I immediately started hiding all the sharp objects, calling James' roommates begging that they come home. He started screaming at me to give him the knives back, how I was horrible and I wouldn't even have sex with him. What use was I? I called my parents and left, and then called his mom because I was scared that he would hurt himself. She let me know that he was my problem now. I should have called the police, but I didn't want to ruin his life. I know. I'm ashamed to say that I got back together with him for 6 more months of hell after that. But today I can safely say, James, please, let's not meet again. Ever again. This took place a while ago. I was 13 and my family had just moved to a new town. A new friend of mine from school and I made plans to go trick-or-treating together. At the time, I remember thinking I was a bit too old to still be trick-or-treating, but who doesn't want free candy? My friend and I figured that we still had 1 year of trick-or-treating left in us. Because we were 13 and lived in a fairly safe neighborhood, my parents thought that it was fine for us to trick-or-treat together without adult supervision. Everything was going great and we were having fun, getting some solid candy, etc. And then we rang on one guy's doorbell. The porch light was on and there was a pumpkin or two, so we figured the people in the house were likely to be handing out candy. A middle-aged man opened the door. At first, I was glad because he was dressed in costume and happy to see my friend and me, so I felt that we were on for some top-tier candy. I don't even remember what candy he handed us, but I do remember what happened next. He asked us to enter into his home, which is weird, but we were 13, so we didn't really think anything of it. And then he asked if he could take our photo. He said that he always liked to take photos of the kids every Halloween because he loved seeing the costumes. On one of his walls were a bunch of pictures of different random, unrelated children in Halloween costumes. At this point, even being a dumb 13-year-old, I was starting to get kinda creeped out. I figured it was best not to upset the man, and let him take the picture and then we could leave. So, he snaps the photo of us and then he pulls out a clipboard with a sheet of paper on it, with a bunch of names written in childish handwriting. He says that he likes the kids whose pics he's taken to sign their names so he can know who they are. At this point, we were both mega creeped out. We should have just run away, but we were too conditioned not to be rude. I decided to sign a fake name. He looked at the paper, looked back up at me and then down at the paper, and then he repeated the fake name that I had given, and I nodded. Luckily after that, he didn't do anything and we were free to leave, but it definitely creeped us both out. At the time, I thought he was just an eccentric guy, but as an adult, looking back on the story, it seems much more sinister. I'm so glad nothing bad happened to us, and hope nothing bad happened to any other kids. Halloween with all these costume kids trick-or-treating in the dark and minimal parental supervision could be a great opportunity for predators to get kids alone in their homes with no one knowing the kids' whereabouts. Please stay safe out there, and happy Halloween, everybody. It was my turn to take my kids trick-or-treating. The previous year was my wife's, and we trade back and forth every year. My son and daughter are ages 7 and 9. Usually, I stay on the street while my kids go up to the different houses to collect candy. After about half an hour of walking around, we came to one of the more popular hotspots for candy collecting, a main street in the neighborhood. Lots of really cool decorations and animatronics on people's lawns. So, I became a bit distracted and I stopped watching my kids closely. At one point, they came back from a house accompanied by another girl about the same height as my daughter. She was wearing a weird homemade mask like a cardboard cutout or something. My daughter asked me if she could trick-or-treat with us, so I said sure and we carried on together as a group. I didn't know who this girl was, but I figured she was a friend from school. As we continued, I started to notice a large man trailing us. He was wearing some sort of angry cat mask. It was kind of creepy, to be honest. I thought that maybe he was the father of the girl, so I tried to start up some small chat with him. I said something like, "Nice weather, huh?" But he didn't respond. He just stood there staring at me, while our kids went up the stairs to the next house. I tried again asking, "Hey, is that your daughter?" He nodded but didn't say anything. I figured he just wasn't in the mood for chatting, so I stopped trying. We carried on for about another 15 minutes until suddenly, my kids came up to me and said that they wanted to go home. This surprised me as we hadn't been out for too long and their bags were only about a third full. In any case, I agreed, waved goodbye at the man in the cat mask and his daughter, and started on our way home. The weird thing is that when I glanced back at the man and his daughter were just standing there staring at us. I checked one more time as we turned the corner and they were still standing there, not having moved at all. At this point, I decided to ask my kids, "So, who was that girl?" My daughter looked up at me with a confused look on her face. "She's your friend," my daughter replied. I asked her what she meant. Apparently the girl with the cardboard mask approached them and said that she was a friend of mine. She told my daughter she was too shy to ask me if she could join us to trick-or-treat, and wanted my daughter to ask me instead. I laughed at the story and replied to my daughter, "Why would you think she was my friend? I don't have any children friends." What my daughter said next chilled my bones. According to her, when the girl with the cardboard mask had approached them for the first time, she wasn't wearing the mask, so they were able to see her face. As it turns out, she wasn't a girl at all, but an older woman around my age with wrinkles on her face. What's even more disturbing is the old woman had started to steal treats from my daughter's bag, apparently when I wasn't looking. This is why they asked me to go home. The old woman was creeping them out and they wanted to just get away from her. I brought my kids home and told my wife what had happened. We made sure to check through all of their candy but didn't find anything suspicious or off. We didn't call the cops or anything, since nothing really happened. But thinking back, I kind of regret that decision now. Okay, so this happened a few years ago when I was 12 years old. I have a twin sister and another sister that was 10 at the time. We were in a family vacation in Orlando, and we were staying in a hotel that was minutes from downtown Disney. After having spent the day at Magic Kingdom, we went to downtown Disney, where many elevators were located. We took one. It was around 11 p.m., and this weird guy comes in with a creepy smile on his face. Immediately, my dad tenses up and looks at my mom, who also felt that something was wrong with him for a reason. The guy looks at my younger sister and asks her by her name how was her day and if she liked chocolate. When asked how he knew this, he answered that he overheard our conversation and wanted to be friendly. Weird, but no big deal. Afterwards, we start going back to our hotel and this guy keeps following us, offering us food, drinks, even wanting to offer us a ride to one of the best restaurants in town. And then my dad told him to screw off, but he wouldn't go. At the next street, we waited for the light to turn red and crossed the street running, hoping to leave him behind us. But the guy kept following us. We saw that he took his phone out, called someone, and 5 minutes later, I realized that a car was now following us. My dad is starting to talk about fighting him, but then we reached the hotel finally. Well, not so much. It turns out the guy had a room in our hotel too, and he started to ask us in an almost imploring way to go to his room, that he had cake and he would even pay us if we would come. We then called the security, and while they were verifying the man's identity, we went the heck away to our room. We never saw the man again, but dang, I just can't imagine what would have happened if we went, and what his intentions were. This is quite possibly the stupidest thing that I've ever done in my life. Early 2000s, I was in my late teens and was on my way to meet up with a coworker, Chris, to watch a movie at his apartment. I had been to his apartment once before. It was one of those huge apartment complexes where every single building looks the same. It was set out in a big rectangle, with a field up against it, meaning that there really wasn't any way to differentiate the buildings, except for numbers on them that were only visible during the day. I remembered that the last time I had been there, I had parked next to a huge boat. So I looked for a huge boat and I parked by it again. I texted him to let him know that I was on my way up, and then I went up to the second floor. I didn't bother checking the apartment number, and I banged on the door really hard, yelling, "Open up," in a deep voice. The door cracked open and all I saw was a half a face peeking out at me. Loud music was thumping and the whole apartment looked dark inside. "What do you want?" the guy mumbled. I never even considered that this was the wrong apartment, but I knew Chris had a roommate, and I hadn't met the guy yet, so derp, I thought this was him. I'm here for Chris," I said. "Who?" the guy asked. And then the door opened all the way, and another guy grabbed my arm. "He's right back here," he said, and he pulled me into the apartment. The music was really loud, and the whole place smelled. The lights were out, with a few strobe lights blinking here and there. I just remembered thinking, this doesn't look like his apartment. Did he move some furniture around? The guy who had pulled me into the apartment wouldn't let go of my arm, and he began pulling me towards the back. He grabbed a cup and tried to give it to me, but I wouldn't take it. The place was packed, and everywhere I looked, people were either shooting up or lighting up or snorting up. I was pretty sheltered at the time, so it felt like walking into a movie set. It just didn't feel real. When we had passed the first bedroom, one of the rooms, I saw a group of people sitting around a blacklight doing God knows what, writhing around, dancing, but I smelled blood at that point. The guy was still trying to drag me to what I assumed was the back bedroom, and that's when it hit me. This is the wrong apartment. I'm exceptionally slow-witted, it appears. I pulled my arm out of the guy's grasp, but had no idea what to do. I knew if I had panicked, bad things would definitely happen. In a split-second decision, I did what I do best. Acted dumb. "Oh goodness, you know what? This is the wrong apartment," I said in the most cheerful voice. I started to leave, but the guy kept pulling me back. "It's cool," was all that he would say. "Stay." I kept pulling myself away and telling him that I had a friend waiting for me, that I'm so sorry to have bothered him, and it looks like a great party, but I had to go. I tried to keep it lighthearted and not, vomit on myself in panic. My phone started buzzing in my hand, and when that happened, he started trying to grab it from me, all the while telling me to stay. "You're here, now have a good time," he said, trying to pry my phone out by death grip. The scary thing about it was that he didn't yell. He didn't speak aggressively at all, though his actions were terrifying. I finally made it to the door and I managed to open it. He gave up, but another guy stepped out and followed me. When I tried to go down the stairs, he blocked the way. "Why you gotta be rude?" He was slurring and weaving around, obviously hammered. I apologized and said that I had to go. My friend was waiting for me. I held up my buzzing phone to show him. It was then that I noticed blood dripping onto the ground in front of him. When I looked to see where it was coming from, I saw that he had blood-soaked paper towels wrapped around his hand. What happened? I don't know why I kept this conversation going. I just wanted out. I'm an idiot. He just shrugged, held up his bloody hand and said in the most nonchalant voice I've ever heard, "I got shot." "Why don't you go to the hospital?" I asked, and immediately regretted it, because he looked at me like I was stupid, which in fairness he wasn't wrong. "Give me your number. You can come over here next time." He pulled his phone out of his pocket. I thought about giving him a fake one, but I wasn't about to push my luck. As soon as he got the digits, he called to make sure my phone would ring. He was satisfied when he saw it ring, and only then did he let me go down the stairs. I fled to my truck shaking. After a few moments, I called Chris and asked him where his apartment was. And when he told me, I looked at the buildings and could just make out that I was one building off. I had the floor and apartment location right, just not the building. I made it up to his apartment, looking behind me the whole time, and told him what had happened. At that point, I was trying not to get weepy. He helped a lot because when I finished telling him what had happened, he laughed at me. That was stupid, which it was, but at the time, it just made me mad. So I went home in a huff. We didn't hang out much after that. I know I keep throwing in there how stupid I was. I can't emphasize this enough. This was completely my fault for not being aware. It could have been completely avoided had I just used my brain. It was sheer luck that something worse didn't happen that night. The guy did call me several times and I never answered. He gave up after a while, but I changed my number just to be safe. I never saw him again. I hope he eventually got medical attention. Several years ago, when I was 25, I lived with, at the time, one of my best friends. Our friendship eventually started to dwindle, as it usually goes when you move in with a good friend, so she was rarely home. This night, however, she ended up staying at her place, heading to bed early. I was a server at the time, so I stayed up pretty late, usually watching YouTube and smoking pot. This night was no different than any other, except for the fact that my neighbors tried to kidnap me. I'll go ahead and give some background info on my house and my neighbors. We lived in a 3-bedroom house with 2 bedrooms and the kitchen facing the crazy neighbors. They were a younger couple living in a smaller mill house. They were constantly coming out to our door asking for handouts. Now normally, I would be happy to help out a neighbor, but they would come over and ask for crazy stuff, like us to fill up an old Mountain Dew bottle with water, because theirs got shut off, beer, and once literally to ask for a single $1. They would constantly be knocking at our door to ask for help, and when we wouldn't answer, I'd peek through the window to see them either jacking cigarette butts from the ashtray or pressing their eyeballs against the door people to see if they could spot us. Anyway, there I was smoking some weed and watching YouTube on my couch when I heard a knock at the door. I rolled my eyes because I knew exactly who was knocking. It was 11 p.m. I checked the people and sure enough, the boyfriend was on my porch. Normally, I would just walk away and continue with my life, but he looked like he was in distress. I opened the door up to see what was up. Hey, I just wanted to come over here and see if you would film my engagement. I got my girlfriend a ring here in my pocket and I need you to follow me to my backyard and film it for me. Baffled but curious, I told him congrats and that I would be out in a second. I just needed to put shoes on. I shut the door behind me and locked it. And quickly, I ran to the back room that looked out into their backyard. I peeked through the blinds to see the setup. Nothing. Pitch black darkness. No signs of decorations or anything like that. Naturally, I woke my roommate up and told her what was going on. Yeah, forget that, she said to me. And we both walked back up to the door after the boyfriend had started banging on it. I looked through the people again. I couldn't see anything and was confused all the way up until he pulled his eyeball away from the people. I quickly turned around and put my back up against the door. My roommate came running back to the door from her room, manning 2 wire hangers for protection. We both clung onto the hangers and sat up against the door until he finally left. We were so freaked out, but we wanted to make sure that we weren't overreacting. We went out to our back door and hopped into her car so we could do a drive-by. They always had their front door open and also didn't have any blinds, so it was easy to see inside of their house. Slowly, we crept by in her car and peered into the living room. Sitting on the couch and all staring at the wall, they looked strung out. It was the couple and an older man. We sped off and ended up staying at a friend's house that night. I never answered the door for either of them again. One day I came home from work and an older lady was parked in their driveway. She walked up to me and got out of the car and asked if I knew where the neighbors were. I told her that I hadn't seen them for a while and she informed me that she was the owner. She told me that they were months late on rent and finally came to evict them. She entered the home to find it completely trashed, needles and garbage everywhere, holes in the wall, and literal crap on the floor. I told her that I was sorry to hear that she had to deal with all that, but I was happy that they were finally gone. I'm not 100% sure what was going on that night, but I'm glad I didn't follow him into the backyard. This happened a long time ago. I'm guessing back in 2006. And I can't have been older than 4 years old at the time. Yet I vividly remember the fear I felt during this encounter. It was an early summer morning and the sun was up, but few people were out. In fact, these streets were practically dead that morning. My mom decided to take my sister, only 1 year old at the time, seated in a stroller, and I, to throw away some garbage at the garbage station. I might add that the garbage station is kind of secluded from nearby houses, bordering one of those deep, dark forests of eastern Sweden. Since I was only 4 when this happened, the memories from the incident had faded a lot. However, my mom remembers all of it. She says that upon entering the station, she immediately got an eerie feeling of being watched. I remember that feeling too. I felt creeped out, even though I didn't know why I was scared. I guess I could sense my mom's fear. Walking along that secluded garbage station, my mom suddenly stopped and told me this. Hold on to the stroller as hard as you can and don't let go, no matter what. That's my most vivid memory I have of this, and I don't think I'll ever forget those words. I'll at least never forget how they made me feel. It was as if my blood had turned to ice. I just froze. My mom sounded stern, but even a toddler can sense when someone's scared out of their mind. My mom was definitely afraid of something. The rest is just a blur. I don't remember much apart from the aforementioned, so I'll let the rest of the story be told from the perspective of my mother. This is the recollection of her experience, recalled to the best of my abilities, but in my own words. Not far from where we were standing, a truck was parked with a man seated in the front. Nothing unusual. A lot of truck drivers stopped to rest by the side of the road. But this man was staring, and he wouldn't stop staring. He stared right at me, examining my body with the determined gaze of a predator, gluing the 3 of us in his sight. He truly seemed pleased by the fear he had instilled on our faces. And his eyes, they were something else, almost as if they didn't belong to a human, but rather to a predator on the savannah. I felt like prey, stuck in the claws of a lion, and I couldn't move. And that's when he smiled at me. I remember that dead smile, those cold, calculating eyes, and the way that he licked his lips, almost as if to say, I could kill you all if I wanted to. I believed this was the point in time, into this strange encounter, when my mom told me to hold on to the stroller, to hold on tightly and not let go. My mom is a small woman, 160 centimeters, weighing only about 48 kilograms, and she could easily have been overpowered by the overweight man in the truck. My mom later admitted she was afraid he would jump out of the truck and knock her out, possibly assaulting her, or even taking me and my younger sister. We bolted out of there. We didn't throw away much garbage that morning. We just turned around and walked home as quickly as my mom could do with a stroller and a 4-year-old toddler at her side. We never talked about what happened that day, up until very recently. The incident has always lingered somewhere in the back of my mind, as that weird thing that happened when I was a kid. And every time I walk past that garbage station, I get a weird feeling in the pit of my stomach. As previously mentioned, this happened around 2006. Fast forward to 2008. The face of a 10-year-old little girl called Engla was printed across the front page of every newspaper in sight. She had been kidnapped and murdered, and the perpetrator was an overweight truck driver named Anders Öcklund, now known as one of Sweden's most infamous killers. Manders Uckland was charged with the murder of Engla, alongside the murder of a woman named Pernilla. And he's also suspected of abducting another little girl who's still currently missing, making him more than one thing. My mom says that when she saw Uckland's picture in the paper, when she saw those cold, familiar eyes, she knew that he was the creepy man from the garbage station that early morning all those years ago. Thinking how my mom or my sister or me, or all of us could have been his victims, that sends chills up my spine. Anders, even though you're behind bars, let's never meet again. This story still gives me chills, and I haven't spoken of it in a while. This is a long story and needs extensive backstory, so please bear with me. Flashback to high school. I wasn't the most social guy in school. I had my really close friends, but other than that, I would classify myself as a loner. I had really bad acne, which affected me a lot when meeting new people, and I was very addicted to World of Warcraft. So, it was a Friday night, a classic raid night in Vanilla WoW. About 2 hours before the raid, my best friend that I grew up with, let's call him T, called me. He was like, "Yo bro, I'm meeting up with 2 women later tonight. Let's drink and hang out with them." It was one of those classic fork in the road moments. Be a nerd and blow another Friday night playing a video game, or go out with my best friend and see if I can finally lose my virginity. Before I get to the next part of the story, I need to give some backstory on T. T was nothing short of a boss, and I truly looked up to him. He was a really good looking guy and was extremely intelligent. I am not understating this. He's the type of guy when he walks into a room, all the women just gravitate to him. But T has a dark side. Even though he has everything going on for him, it was never good enough. He got expelled from the school that we both went to for having a couple grams of weed. Just trying to flex, and he really got caught by a teacher. So he was sent to another school about 30 minutes away from me. Nothing changed, and it actually got far, far worse. He became the guy. He started dating all the hot chicks and became a massive drug dealer. He supplied about 4 or 5 high schools and colleges in the area, and was for sure on the radar of the law and other rivals. Now back to the story. So, after playing mental ping pong for about 30 minutes, weighing all my options, potentially get laid, drunk, or nerded up like usual, I finally said screw it. Count me in for tonight, T. I bribe my brother for $20 and he agrees to raid for me, and the night begins. T picks me up from my place and greets me with a big smile and says, "We're getting laid tonight, brother." I'm like, whatever bro, we'll see. I'm very used to T over-exaggerating. So I quickly ask, when are we meeting up with these women? It's about 9:30 at this point. Under his voice, he says around 1 a.m. I'm like, what the heck are we supposed to do for 3.5 hours? T pulls out a bottle of Bacardi 151 with the metal grate and passes it to me. Thankfully, I had been drinking pretty hard that year, so my tolerance was decent. We head to this awesome park to burn time and start passing the bottle back and forth. We catch up on life, and we're about a 6 out of 10 drunk at this point. It's around 11:30. So with an hour and a half still to burn before we're supposed to meet with said woman, T says, "Hey, let's roll to Taco Bell. We can get some food and sober up." At this point, I'm drunk and we have some time to burn, so what the hell? Let's go to Taco Bell. As most degenerates know, Taco Bell is open late, and the one that we went to was located in a shopping center. No surprise around 12 a.m. There are no cars there whatsoever in the parking lot, except for the workers. T rolls up to buy his food and we just park outside Taco Bell while he eats. While T is eating, I snag a cigarette and get some fresh air. As I puff away on the cigarette, a white van rolls up with tinted windows and no license plate. The van parks to the west of our car about 50 feet away in this empty parking lot. The lights inside and outside of the van instantly turn off and no one gets out. I keep smoking and I don't think much of it. I mean, we're essentially doing the same thing, but a car with no license plate is obviously weird. I get back into T's car and I start getting a really uneasy feeling about this van. At this point, I've sobered up a little bit, and I just keep eyeing down this van. Something doesn't feel right. It chose to park 3/4 of the way into the parking lot, with a perfect view of our car. I turn to T and tell him that it's time to leave. This is where the backstory comes into play. As I mentioned, T was in very deep at this point and was at the height of his drug dealing career. So, that exact thought was in the back of my mind when this van was parked inconspicuously. This next part is not exaggerated in the slightest. T turns on his headlights to his car to leave, and I kid you not, almost instantly after our lights are on, the white van turns their lights on too. My stomach dropped to the floor. At this point, we're both freaking out. T knows that he could be busted by the police at any point, and that's not even considering all his rivals and people that he screwed over. So, right when we see the light turn on from the van, we turn ours off. And no joke, the van does the exact same thing and mimics our reaction. T reaches to the backseat of his car and pulls out a backpack with a weapon in it. I can't believe this is actually going down. At this point, I'm inching on crying. This is obviously no coincidence. We were followed to the shopping center. We sat paralyzed in fear and dripping in sweat for the next 10 minutes, waiting to see if the van would move. It didn't. T started mumbling to himself. This might be a goon squad that was hired to hunt me down. I'm speechless to that comment. I was a normal, unsocial kid who loved sports and video games, and now I'm in this terrible and possibly life-threatening situation. At this point, I really wish I would have just stayed home and played World of Warcraft. No potential sex is worth the heart attack I'm currently going through. I felt extremely nauseous and I am so close to throwing up. Is this actually happening or am I dreaming? This doesn't feel like the police. They wouldn't go through this type of charade. They would have turned off their lights and arrested us by now. I can't stand this demented showdown that we're currently in. I'm on the verge of a mental breakdown, and tears are rolling down my face. I turn to T and tell him to turn on his lights one more time. Almost like clockwork, the van flicks on their lights, but this time it was very different. I was able to see multiple shadows of hooded men in the van. I turn to T and tell him to book it out of there. I've never seen someone go 0 to 60 out of a shopping center before, but you can bet your ass we did. T turns his head while exiting the shopping center and sees the van following us at a fast pace. We start cutting down side roads for the next 5 minutes. Thankfully, no one is following us anymore. At this point, I'm just staring at T and asking him, "What the heck was that?" T says with a weak voice, "I have no idea, other than what you know I do, drug dealing." We take a deep breath and we hit the bottle some more. The next 20 minutes we sat in silence and came to grips with almost being involved in a sting operation, robbed by rivals or even worse. Once our heart rates had dropped under 250 beats per minute, we finally headed out to meet the woman. And T and I never spoke of it again. And to this day, the thought of that night still chills me to the core. In 2012, I, a 20-year-old female, went with my boyfriend to a diner on a Wednesday night. This place advertised free pie Wednesday when you spend X amount of dollars. The restaurant was right by his apartment, literally less than a 5-minute drive. It was a rainy night and the restaurant was in a southern college town, but not close enough to campus to get much of a late-night crowd, and definitely not in the rain. Both of us enjoy quiet places, so we spontaneously decided to give it a try. The place was a normal, bland-looking chain restaurant shaped like a U. From one end of the restaurant, it would be impossible to see what was going on the other end. It's around 9 p.m. Not all restaurants are going to be open past then, but diners like this often are. The Waffle House and Denny's near campus is usually pretty hopping late into the night. This place was empty except one bubbly female staff member. I'd been in food service and I asked the waitress what time they close, because I hate when people come in right at closing time. She says that they're open at midnight. Lucky us. Our waitress was a skinny, petite, maybe 30-year-old woman who sat us away from the front. She introduced herself as Sally, and right away I got the distinct feeling she was lying about her name. It's the way that she took a moment to smile after she had said it. It reminded me of the way my sister, who was a certified pathological liar, would slip in a little lie. Something was a little off, but nothing alarming. I mean, my sister is completely harmless. I noticed Sally isn't wearing a name tag, just jeans and a polo shirt. She gives us menus and again says that her name is Sally. And again, I'm picking up on those subtle body language cues that I learned from living with a habitual liar. So I'm thinking Sally is full of crap. It stands out in my memory as my first impression. The second impression was, damn, this lady talks a lot. I haven't seen you before. Are you new? Are you here for college? I had great roommates in college. Do you have any roommates? Aren't Thursdays the worst? There's nothing to do. Do you have any plans for later? It was kind of annoying, but she seemed nice and we figured she was probably just bored out of her mind and or making an effort to get tips for being friendly. It became clear that we were the only guys, and there weren't even other food servers for her to talk to. As far as I could see, it was just the three of us. We didn't want to be rude, so we just answered her obnoxious questions, thinking it was an attempt for small talk. After our main dinner, she took our order for pie and then started chatting up about the weather. It's so dangerous to drive in the rain, blah blah blah. It should blow over soon, but I would wait here if I were you. I started to get a bit creeped out. Like, why was she being so clingy? It wasn't necessarily a feeling of being in danger. More like, why are you so obsessed with me? So, I get creeped out but then feel bad for it. Who do I think I am, Regina George hating on some nerd? The lady probably just really needs to bring home some tip money. She brings us 2 slices of pie and gives us some peas. The pie was gross. It had a mixed berry and it tasted super fake sweet. Very artificial, like a child's lip gloss flavor. I don't know why I ate more than 1 bite, other than I was broke and never wasted food. After a few crunchy bites, I look to the back of the diner and the waitress is standing near our back door, staring at us with some man. Heavy-set, pale skin, sweat-stained white shirt, a huge barrel of a man, with a facial expression like he was watching cockroaches that he was about to step on. They were both just staring silently. My blood went cold. All the hairs on my neck went up. They saw that I was looking at them and they went into the kitchen quickly. Finally, alarm bells in my brain are ringing like a freaking tornado siren. I whispered, "We need to leave now. Just sneak out and go." My boyfriend could see that I was freed. He threw down some cash with a big tip, grabbed our jackets and left our gross half-eaten pie, and we bolted. We drive home and start laughing at our overreaction. That man was probably just a cranky cook who wanted us to go so he could chill. And that waitress was just fishing for tips. And boy did she look out. She got well over a 50% tip. because I was too chicken to wait for change. I'm feeling silly and really rude for judging a book by its cover and running out on the nice lady like that. And then the night went from kind of creepy to actual horror. I remember laughing in the car, and then I was waking up shivering and shaking in our dark apartment. My boyfriend was laying on top of the bed, fully dressed with his shoes on. I had been slumped over, half on the bed, half on the floor, also dressed in my rain-soaked jeans and boots. But I think I had my jacket off. It was midnight. I didn't remember parking or unlocking the door, walking inside or anything from the last 2 hours. I wake my boyfriend up in a panic. He remembers coming back, but not too clearly. He says that he remembers going to the bathroom and becoming super disoriented, like the room was spinning but feeling a strange calm. And then nothing. We had both blacked out, something neither of us experienced before or after. We didn't have a drop of alcohol or intentionally do any drugs. Holy balls, are we lucky that we live so close, literally a 3-minute drive away. If we passed out like that on the road, who knows what would have happened if we had stayed at the restaurant for even 3 more minutes. This was almost 10 years ago, and I remember calling the non-emergency police line about it in the morning after I had calmed down a little. The person that I talked to on the phone sounded like they didn't believe me and questioned if I was partying. I wasn't, and generally had the tone that I was wasting their time. It was a frustrating phone call where the police person asked, "Well, what do you want me to do?" I don't remember my response. It was awful. Probably worse than the feeling of violation from that night was the attitude of annoyance and dismissal from the authorities. Later, I looked up the restaurant online, and the hours are 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. Just a little extra spice to the WTF soup and further confirmation that something definitely wasn't right from the get-go. What sober person passes out like that, slumped over the edge of the bed in cold rain-soaked clothing? 2 sober people with no history of fainting just collapse for no reason. I think we've all been told never to leave your drink alone if you go out to a bar or a party. It never occurred to me that same danger could come from a chatty waitress in a chain restaurant. I was at 9 or 10, and this was back in the early 90s when latchkey kids were fine and no one blinked an eye. I was home alone and decided to walk to my local Blockbuster, maybe a 30-minute there and back. I had done it before on my bike and wasn't worried or scared. I took off and got about halfway down my block when all the craziness had started. A side note, unbeknownst to me, my neighbor's son was a drunk or a drug addict, or something was wrong with him. My parents evidently knew but didn't tell me because he has moved out a while back, I guess. All of a sudden, here comes a cherry picker roaring down the street, going super fast. I remember because several other cars passed and this one made me jump and look up. There was a man shirtless in the top of the cherry picker hollering stuff like, "Oh yeah, woo!" and your basic drunken BS. I immediately felt uncomfortable, and before I could decide what I wanted to do, he saw me. He yelled something out at me and threw a beer bottle down. That freaked me out, and I immediately decided this trip was over and that I was going back home. I turned around and started back towards my house, but nervously decided to start heading into people's yards to make it look like I was going into a different house. That didn't help at all. He was already heading toward me. The driver was now slapping his hand on the truck door, obviously drunk as well. They were yelling out to me with garbage like, "Hey little girl, where are you going?" I ducked behind a house and saw a large pine tree between the 2 yards, so I jetted out and ducked behind it to see if they were still following me. To my absolute terror, the guy in the bucket goes, "I see you hiding behind that tree, little girl." At that point, I lost it. I ran as fast as I could in a sheer panic to my house, backyard, and I ran in locking it behind me. I ran and checked the other locks and went into my parents' master bathroom and crawled into the shower and put a towel over me. I was sobbing. I called my mom and dad, who told me to hang up and call 911. I did, and they asked me if I was hidden, which was so terrifying. Nothing happened after that. The cops arrived right after my parents had pulled in and acted like they had been home. I roll, but they're good people. The cops actually found the men, and they were arrested and charged with my stuff, along with many other things they had evidently been up to that day. I wasn't the only one that they had harassed in our neighborhood, but I was the only child. And of course, it was our neighbor's drunken, disorderly son. In the fall of 2010, I decided to go back to college. I was a single mom of 3 boys, but they were all in school now, so me going back was finally possible. The school that I went to is a regional campus to a very large university, and located in a neighborhood that is known for crime and other illegal activities. But it was only a 20-minute drive from my home, and I didn't feel unsafe about going there. The first day and first class were intimidating. I didn't know anyone, and I was a lot older than most students. I was 28 at the time. I sat down in the back of the room at a table, and a few minutes later, a lady who was around my age sat down next to me. She was very skinny, smelled like cigarettes, greasy hair, sunken eyes. But she started to talk to me, and she seemed normal enough. She started off the normal conversation telling me that she chose to sit next to me because I was wearing the prettiest blouse in the room. Strange, but as an awkward person, I leave a lot of leeway for people to say or do awkward things before I think too deep about things. She didn't have a backpack, any books, a pen, a notebook, nothing. She said that her financial aid hadn't come through yet, but she didn't want to fall behind in classes and asked if she could share my book. I agreed, and I gave her a pen and paper also. After the first class, she asked if I would mind going to the library with her, so she could scan some of the pages to take home. I agreed, and we started to head to the library. She stops and she looks at her phone and says that her son had just texted her and needs her to come home to do something. She asks if I'll come with her. I tell her I have another class shortly and that I can't go with her. I ask if she still wants to go to the library first. She says no, and that she has to get to her son, but really can't go alone. I keep telling her that I can't go with her, and then she starts crying. At this point, we were in a common area outside, and the parking lot was to one side, and the library was to another. I tell her that I need to go to the library, and she's welcome to come, talk, whatever she needs, but I have to go. I didn't like being outside away from people, and with this woman anymore, and was trying to get back to a busier area. She gets really upset, starts screaming, and basically says, "F you" to me. She may have actually said, "F you." I can't remember how the interaction went exactly, because I was frozen in confusion by how quickly she had transitioned from friendly, then to crying and scared, and now to screaming in my face a slew of hateful, angry things. I turned around to start walking to the library, and called my friend so that I would have someone aware if this lady tried anything more than just screaming. I get to the library vestibule, and watch her through the glass doors. She is standing at the parking lot, and then a car pulls up with a man in it and is obviously upset with the woman. They're arguing, but I can't hear them from inside the vestibule. Eventually, she gets in the car and she leaves with him. The next day, I was dreading class because I didn't know what this woman's attitude would be that day. But she wasn't there the next day. In the end, she never came back to class. I didn't know her name or at the time how to look at a class roster. But looking back, I'm fairly certain she was not enrolled at the school at all, and for whatever reason was trying to get me to leave with her. I wish I knew her intentions, but at the same time, I'm glad that I never had to find out. I was in college. My roommate was a born-again Christian and she invited me to her Bible study in church all the time. Eventually, I went and I kept going. I wasn't a fan of the pastor, but there are a lot of nice young adults who like to have clean, sober fun. And I didn't drink or party, so I felt like I fit in. But I didn't agree with everything they believed in. Just the more normal stuff like God and helping the poor, and not some of the other things. And this one guy in my Bible study, Drew, was pretty quiet, good looking. He seemed like he knew everything about the Bible, which amazed me. I thought, I know nothing about all of this, but he is so wise. I was 21 and he was 27. He wasn't a college student, he just worked, which I later learned maybe he didn't. We were going to go on a young adult retreat, and because I worked, I couldn't leave early on Friday to drive up to the mountains with the girls in my group. Mutual friends said that I could ride with Drew, so I said, okay. On the way up, Drew was pretty quiet for the first hour. Not very friendly at all, and it was a long trip. But as we got closer to the mountains, he really warmed up. We got pizza and he paid, which was nice. And then he just stopped the car so we could just look at the stars. He even played some Brian McKnight. He was turning it into a date, but I didn't know it or see it that way then. I was starting to really like him, and I felt like we had a connection. He was just about to drop me off at the girls' cabin when he suddenly gets very serious and tells me that something happened between him and another girl in our church group, but she is telling lies about him and to not believe whatever I hear. He doesn't explain what exactly happened, and doesn't say who it is. I enter the cabin, and all the girls are there, and very quickly one girl, Bree, who is probably the youngest in the group, she's 19, tells all of us, "Ladies, there's a wolf in sheep clothing among us at this retreat." Now, if you don't know church folk, they get very dramatic and talk like this all the time, so I just thought, okay, here's some drama. She tells us this story about how she was talking to some guy here, but he started stalking her and wouldn't take no for an answer, and he even threatened her sister. Now, my spidey sense is up and I realized this must be what Drew was telling me about. The church group doesn't know who it is because she won't say, because she doesn't want to gossip and says leadership will handle it. Well, Drew eventually leaves the weekend retreat early. There goes my ride back, I thought. I don't know if he was asked to leave or what. That week though, Drew asked me to hang out and we do. I still like him, and I don't know who to believe. On our hangout, we don't really do anything. He takes me to the mall and he reads the Bible to me. Okay, cool. And then he parks his car on some suburban lookout, the top of the world type of thing, and just says that he is a view guy who really likes views. I'm not one to be impressed by suburban lights, so I'm just like, okay, this is boring. I give him another chance. I invite him to come see a play with me. When he comes, he immediately meets one of my friends, Brian. Brian introduces us to his boyfriend, Nick. I'm in theater, and I have a lot of gay friends. Well, for the majority of the rest of the date, Drew lectures me about how it's wrong, and I must not really love him if I don't stop to tell him that. I eventually cry because it is this ugly argument in his car we are having for hours in the parking lot of Panera. I say I want to go home, that this is basically the worst date ever. I don't agree with what he says. He also tells me that I need to give up my dream of being an actress because what if the Lord doesn't want me to do that? Theater is something I did my whole life, not to mention my major, and his reasons for me giving it up had nothing to do with the impracticality of it, but because of God. This guy was nuts. I get home and I offer to make us some cocoa to just kind of end things as friends, or at least on a better note. I know that I'll see him at church and we have mutual friends and are in the same Bible study. Things got weird. He tried to get sexual with me, but then also blamed me for tempting him. How with my tear-stained, exhausted face? I ended up crying again. I just wanted him to go home, but I was so emotionally exhausted. I didn't know what to make of this. He calls and texts me that week and I don't respond. Then it's a Sunday night. I'm talking to my friend Tim, who no longer goes to this church anymore. I tell him that I went on a date with Drew. Before I can tell him how it went, Tim says, "What? That guy is crazy. You need to abort that mission." Tim tells me that he is close with Bree and her family, and Drew is a stalker and he threatened Bree's sister. I don't know what to believe because it sounds like Tim believes this just based on Bree's story. I hang up and I call my mom to try to tell her what happened, what Tim had told me about Drew, and how it was such weird timing considering what had happened with me. While I'm on the phone with my mom, I get a knock at the door. It is 10 p.m. on a Sunday night. I look out, but no one is there. I go to get my roommate to ask her if she can just sit with me in the front room, because I'm freaked out and I think someone is there. There's another knock at the door. I open it and it's Drew, and he looks all in a frenzy. I ask him what he's doing here, and he said he just needed to talk to me, and I wasn't answering my phone, which was because I was generally busy earlier in the day. The conversation is getting long and my roommate is still sitting there, so I tell her she can go back to her room and that it's okay. I let him come in, because I am conditioned to be overly nice. This was a big mistake. We start talking, and as soon as my roommate is gone, he pulls out a knife. He starts saying how he was worried my neighbors did something to me because I wasn't responding to him, and he didn't know what kind of situation he would be walking into. I have zero fighting skills, no experience in the situation at all, so I calmly say as casually as possible, "Hey, can you just put the knife away? It makes me feel uncomfortable." He asked me if I want the knife and I say, "No, I just want to pretend that it isn't here." I somehow talk him down and get him to leave. I think I convince him that he still has a shot with me somehow. The next morning, my mind is clearer, and I feel like I need to tell my mom what happened. She has me tell my dad, who has me tell the church youth leader and security at my apartment. I tell the cop the whole story, and he says that this guy is definitely a stalker, and that I will see him again unless the police call him. I say, "It's fine, I think everything will be okay, there's no need to call." I just didn't want any more drama. I had never talked to the police about anything before. I was still processing and I didn't understand that this was really serious. My mistake. The next night, I went to a party, another church-related one, but Drew is not supposed to be here. He told me that he wasn't going. Well, he is there. I decided to leave, but my 21-year-old self doesn't think to ask to have someone walk me out. I figure if I leave and he's still there, problem solved. I didn't anticipate him realizing that I left and following me. I'm walking to my car in a dark apartment parking lot and I hear him call out my name. He's following me. I start running and I say that I don't want to talk. And then he chases me. I'm clicking my car to open thinking, oh, this is how the girl dies because she did not let the cop call the stalker because she's dumb. But thankfully, my car unlocks, I get in, and I drive away. The problem is, this guy knows where I live. I move out 2 weeks later, and I block him on all social media on my phone. Drew eventually somehow managed to make another Facebook profile, and sent me a message that summer saying he was praying for me, and that he had forgiven me for trashing him to people, even though I still never told anyone what had happened. Except for the useless pastor who did nothing. That was the last that I saw or heard from him. Unfortunately, this predator continues to serve at that church in the junior high ministry of all places, among many young girls. No one on church leadership listened to me or to Bree, who both complained that this guy was stalking us. I never reached out to Bree to let her know what had happened to me, and I never got to hear her story in detail. But I had told the younger adult pastor about the knife and him trying to get sexual with me and how I was scared. Thankfully, I don't go to that church anymore. What sucks is, I have had a few experiences with crazy religious dudes. This was the first but not the last. I'm still trying to come to terms with why that is. My first semester of freshman year in college, I had a history class at 9 a.m. The class had at least 50 people, but I literally knew no one. I was fine with that. The lectures were actually interesting. We had minimal homework, and the class wasn't hard at all. I sat towards the back of the class. So, one day out of nowhere, I got an email on my college email account. It was some random guy that was like, "Hey, I'm Joe. I'm in your history class. How do you like it?" Or something along those lines. I thought this was really creepy because not only did I have no idea who Joe was, but also, who uses a school email to start talking to someone? I got his name from the email account and decided to look him up on Facebook, thinking maybe I knew this guy or something. That's when I discovered that about 2 weeks before the email had been sent, he had requested to be my friend on Facebook, and I hadn't responded because I had no idea who he was. He also messaged me 11 times and Facebook called me. Okay, what the heck? So, I spoke to my roommate and her friend that night about it. They basically told me that I should just message him and tell him that I'm not interested. I messaged him back on Facebook and told him basically, no thanks. He seemed to get the message and it was fine. I looked for him in class next Monday and realized that he sat about 4 rows in front of me near the middle of the class. He would fully turn to stare at me throughout the class, and I considered telling the professor because he made me so uncomfortable. Thankfully, we only had a couple of weeks left. After the class was over, I figured I wouldn't see him again. Different majors, he was older, and I didn't really think about him. I had a math class on the other side of campus next semester. I could have taken the trolley, but I normally like to take the 15-minute walk to get there. One day, as I walked in the building, I saw Joe walking out. I basically opened the door to go in as he was standing there about to leave. He didn't even move and he just stared at me, waiting for me to walk past him. By the way, he was easily over 6 foot and pretty big. His demeanor really made me feel weird, but I pushed past him and I went into class. When the class was over, I walked out to head back to my dorm when I saw Joe just hanging around the building alone. I started walking and he began walking like 6 feet behind me. Okay, weird, but maybe he's just going somewhere. After a couple of minutes, I got more and more nervous about him, and I spotted 2 of my roommate's friends in front of me walking to the dorm as well. I literally inserted myself into their conversation and was just like, "Hi, I know you barely know me, but please walk with me. I'm being followed." And they were really cool about it. He continued to follow us until we came to a crosswalk. He walked past us, turning to stare directly at me. And the look he gave me freaked out the 2 girls I was with so much that they suggested we take the long way back to our rooms. We did. And despite the fact that we should have seen him again on this path, we didn't. The weirdest part of all of this is why he was hanging around the building. He had been walking out as I went in. My class was over an hour, so he should have been long gone by then. The only restaurant on that side of campus was closed by then, and if he had had class, he would have still been in it. I got out a couple of minutes early. So was he literally just waiting for me to leave? I honestly don't really want to know. Joe, let's not meet again. I'm a South Asian female. This happened when I was in my first year of engineering, and this was almost 10 years ago. Harmless ragging was a thing back then, and as juniors, we were asked for no more than to sing a song or to imitate a professor and such silly stuff. This one senior guy named Adish happened to come across me in one of these silly ragging sessions, and apparently found me interesting and cute. I wore shorts a lot, and he even nicknamed me as Sassy Pants, and he yells it out loud whenever he sees me on campus, irrespective of the crowd of people. He tries to get my number through my classmates and hostel mates, and tries to get to add me on Facebook. When I don't respond, he threatens my friends to force me into talking to him. I do cause I just don't want him to get beat up. I obviously don't want to cause any problems as I was barely 18 and I was away from home for the first time. Adish keeps asking me to go out with him and I keep refusing. One day, I'm at the local ATM to take out some money, and it's a small room with just the machine. I didn't know he was there because I'm facing the inner area, and he walks in and he stands against the only door of that enclosure. I turn around in a panic thinking that I'm about to be robbed, but it's this guy who says, "Come on, I'll take you to campus on my bike." I refuse and he won't let me out. The guard luckily comes and he obviously has to move. I share this with my friends and they are horrified too. Now the stalking begins. He messaged me on Facebook and says what color dress I wore and if something noteworthy happened in the lectures that I attended each day. He challenges me to find out how he is able to know so much. He knows my routine so well, he comes down to my hostel and openly asks me to go out with him, in front of all including the maintenance staff. I again avoid responding and I'm mortified. I threaten him that if he interferes in my life, I will report his behavior to the dean and other authorities. But the creep responds, "It's not like I asked you to sleep with me. I have tons of girls who want to be with me, and I ignore them all for you. I know girls play the hard to get card, but this is way too arrogant for you." This goes on for 6 months, nearing the end of the semester. Thankfully, he is in the final year and will graduate and get the heck out of here. That was the only thought keeping me from having a nervous breakdown. On the day of the Foundation Day celebration on campus, it's evening and he calls on my phone and asks me to meet him one last time. I ignore his calls as usual. He calls one of my friends and threatens to throw acid on her, which she tearfully calls me and informs me, leaving me visibly shaken. I tell my friends about this. We are all still thick even after 10 years after college, knock on wood. And they, my loyal soldiers, say, "Okay, if he wants to talk to you one last time, fine, let him, but in front of all of us." I tell him that and he comes over to campus where the event is still ongoing. My entire group of friends step out, 7 of us including me, which has 4 guys, and meet him nearby. He asks in mock politeness if he can talk to me alone, and even before I can respond no, my friends are like, "Either you talk to her in front of all of us, or you don't talk to her at all." He conceded and he spoke some rubbish romantic talk which doesn't matter, and he finally leaves. A few days later, it's their graduation day, and I've thankfully never seen or heard from him since. So, I live in supported housing. This means that I basically have a room in a house that I share with others who have learning disabilities. When my best friend moved in, this one particular tenant, who we soon started calling Creeper, full-on stalked her. He would lurk outside our room late at night, waiting for her to come out. If she didn't come out, he would go outside and knock on her window. He would watch her come out of the shared bathroom from the top of the stairs. He tried to kiss her, and one time touched her on the shoulder and said he was looking after her, when a support worker asked what he was doing. He also waited on the stairs when her and I came back from a trip at like 11:30 at night. Needless to say, we waited around the side of the building until he went away. He also watched her through his blinds, and he's been warned at least 3 times by support workers to leave her alone. Now here's the worst part. He's 45 and she's 22. And he has a girlfriend who he's been with for 10 years, but he doesn't like her very much, judging by the frustrated phone calls he has with her on the daily. Now, he also displayed a milder form of this behavior when I moved in, but he started leaving me alone within a few months. But the difference with my friend is that he is infatuated with her. Not only is he emotionally and physically trying to cheat on his girlfriend, who he doesn't even seem to like, but he's been doing it since my friend moved in, which was at the beginning of the year. He needs to be charged with something, and his girlfriend needs to dump him. He needs to be thrown out of the house too. But people keep giving him an excuses not to have him punished, and I'm sick of it. If it weren't for whatever he has, he'd be in prison. I wanted to share this because I'm done with him. I want him to leave my friend alone. I want him out of the house. The staff aren't doing anything about it, so I'm going to take matters into my own hands. But what should I do? So, this is my second time writing in this sub. I'm a female in my early 20s, and I filed a police report and have already told the story to those close to me. But I feel like venting about my piece of crap ex-housemate to you guys, and then it would make me feel a little bit better. Kareem is somewhat close to his name, so I'll use that. Now, I'm not very good at reading people, unlike my landlord. When I first met Kareem, he seemed polite enough. He was super tidy, filled the house with amazing smelling cooking, and best of all, he stayed out of my way. I'm kind of a loner and stayed holed up in my room with the company of my gerbils to quietly study and play Minecraft. We didn't cross paths often when the school year had started in September. He was the replacement for my housemate. It's a 3-bedroom apartment, and I had been living with another girl, Nellie, for a year already. She was pretty absent from the house, and as she was almost always at her boyfriend's place, and the third housemate had moved out. Early on, he was honest of his past that I should have taken as a warning, but took him as being earnest. I had asked him during the mini interviewing process that Nellie and I were holding for potential tenants if he was 420 friendly. He was, but as it turned out, he was a little too friendly. A couple years ago, he had been arrested for illegal possession of weed and sent back to his home country of Turkey for a year before being allowed back into Canada to continue his studies. Now, I didn't know how this kind of stuff works, to be honest, but that's what he told us. I try not to be a judgmental person, since he made it seem like it was a thing of the past. I learned this was not the case. One of the first things I noticed in September was that he smoked almost constantly. Not to the point of missing classes, but the whole house would stink up multiple times a week in the evening. Normally, I wouldn't mind a little smoke, but any stoner will tell you that each strain is different, and for whatever reason, his weed had caused really severe panic attacks for me. Around late October, I got sick of his stuff and told him to figure out how to contain it to his room, and he said that his joints are hard to contain, and that he really needed a bong. So I let him borrow mine. About 2 weeks later, in November, Kareem said that he had broken the downstem, but that he would replace it. Within a few days, he did replace it, but it was the wrong size. Maybe it was a bit picky of me, but I told him to buy the right size, and he refused, said that it was too expensive. I mean, I don't know, it's my property and he broke it. He should fix it appropriately, right? Let me know if that request was out of line. What I know was not out of line, however, was what I did after what happened in mid-February. Around January, my landlord said we should start looking for new housemates, which was reasonable enough. Not to Kareem, though. My landlord had always been slower responding to messages due to the nature of her job, but he absolutely hated her guts for it. Called her awful things and every name under the sun behind her back, which made me feel weird considering I had been her tenant for 3 years now and we were on good terms. Before I move on to the next part, I would like to quickly add that at one point during the housemate hunting process, he asked me if I would be willing to move out so that his friends could move in, and that it would be super amazing if I did. Obviously I said no. My landlord later confirmed that he had asked her if he could sign the lease behind my back. As I mentioned earlier, we had forged a good rapport over the last 2 years, so it was a firm no. Kareem had got excessively antagonistic about my landlord's deadline when she wanted us to sign the lease. Started at looking at the law, saying he legally didn't need to give her notice until X date, which wasn't true. He told me to quietly look for housemates and tell the landlord at the last possible date, which made me super uncomfortable since it was around midterms, and was secretly grateful she was pushing for the deadline so strongly. I just wanted it over with. It was shortly before I signed the lease with my new housemates that he showed how truly two-faced he was. I dug through our Facebook messages. The gist of the conversation was this. Kareem, can I use your laundry after I move out? I don't have laundry on site. Sorry, no, that's kind of weird. No, it's not, we'll pay you. We? Yeah, me and my housemates. Note, I never met these housemates before and still have no idea who they are. At this point, I started getting extremely weirded out. I said no a few times, but caved and started saying stuff like, I'll think about it, to appease him, though I had zero intent of letting him use my stuff. It seemed like the best way to get him off my back since for almost a week he had continuously pressured me and to try to get me to say yes. Things hit the first of 2 crescendos when, the day before, me and the 2 new tenants I chose, super awesome dudes by the way, were supposed to sign the new lease. Back to Facebook, and again, an approximation of our conversation. If you don't promise to let me use your laundry next year, I'm going to make a scene in front of your housemates. A scene. When they come sign the lease with her, I'm going to tell them how awful our landlord is, that she doesn't care about us and is terrible at replying to our messages. If you let me use your laundry, I'll wait until they leave to tell her to her face. In other words, he was going to make my new housemates question my judgment and make them think that I was a bad person or something. Why else would he go off in front of them and my landlord and tell me she was a horrible and nasty person? He later claimed that these messages were a joke to which I messaged back asking where the punchline was, because I didn't see it. I felt like a badass saying that, not gonna lie. Especially since he never got around to explaining the supposed joke. At this point, I had a bit of a breakdown. I called my landlord that night when Kareem had left the house for a few hours, letting her know exactly what had happened, and what he was planning to do the next day, even sending our screenshots of our Facebook messages, and telling her that I couldn't let her and my new housemates come over in good conscience. Call me a snitch, I don't care. This guy does martial arts 3 times a week and, despite being shorter than me, could definitely send me through drywall if he felt like it. I felt threatened and didn't want to know what he would do if he found out that I told her, and was the reason signing the lease was rescheduled to a different time and location. She believed me, especially when she read all the text messages. Full context, nothing conveniently cropped. She even saw the parts where I was playing along and calling her names too. That's when she told me that she had seen straight through his act while he was signing the lease. Apparently, he spent half an hour reading and rereading our lease, which is abnormal, asking weird questions and being rude to her. After years of being a landlord, she could clearly see that he's the type of overly macho guy that likes to control women, but gave me the benefit of the doubt. I'm inclined to agree, especially looking in hindsight at how he's treated the women, me, the landlord, and Nellie, versus men, Nellie's boyfriend and my male friends, in our lives. So I signed the lease with my new housemates the next day at a coffee shop, telling Kareem that it was out of the blue that we were signing elsewhere, and that I had no idea why we had changed plans, and I thought that I had gotten away with telling on him. Until my landlord sent him a letter from her lawyer that we very clearly stated that he would not be allowed to demand the use of the laundry again, and that if he came back to the house after moving out, it would be considered trespassing. At first, I thought it was an overreaction on her part, but looking back on those messages, I can see why she made that decision. He angrily knocked on my door and shoved the letter in my hands when he got in that day, aggressively and quite frankly, melodramatically saying, "You betrayed me." I kid you not, those were his exact words. I think he lost his grip on me since he could no longer pressure me now that the secret was out, which frustrated him. Things then settled down temporarily. He would retaliate in small ways, going out of his way not to sort the recycling in proper bins, not cleaning out the shower drain, putting plastic and metal in the compost bin, and smoking weed excessively. They were small, but they irritated me. It was the day after he moved out that we reached our second and final crescendo, which led to the police report from the initial paragraph. After months of stuffing a shirt under the crack of my door to keep the weed stink out, and generally being freaked out to the point of carrying a small kitchen knife in my pocket whenever I left my room after the laundry incident, you can bet your butt I was counting down those last days gleefully. He said that he left a few things behind from the kitchen. He came along with a friend and we sorted out whose Tupperware was whose. On his way out, he spotted my mop and bucket. He claimed that it was his and that he wanted it back. I had had this mop and bucket for 2 years. Why the heck was he claiming that it was his? I said no and he started roaming around the house, saying that he wanted his mop and bucket, and that if this was mine, his must be elsewhere, which made me uncomfortable as hell. I diffused the situation by saying I wanted to use it, and I would give it back later. I was planning on keeping it. I am under zero obligation to let him back in. Remember the letter that said him coming back in the house after he moves out is trespassing, and he instantly snapped out of it. Later that day, he even said that I could keep it. Why he changed his mind is beyond me. The next day, Kareem said he had left 2 more items behind. I was irritated at this point. I just wanted to be left alone. I said I would leave it outside. I admit I definitely shouldn't have done what I did next. I was annoyed and I cringe when I read my own messages, but his reaction was completely out of proportion. Kareem said, "Yeah, I'll stop by in a few hours. I just got out of the shower. I'm busy, can't you come by now? Just throw on some shoes and shorts and a t-shirt, nobody's outside." By the way, at this point, my town had been on lockdown for 2 months. Since it's a university town and I live in an area almost exclusively populated by students, nearly everyone was gone and it had been a ghost town for weeks. I should also note that he had not been taking good social distancing measures whenever he was over, and had zero problem getting him close even though he had recently been to a much bigger city with a bad outbreak. Just thought that I would point that out. Fine, then give me my mop and bucket. You said that I could have it. Give it back. No. I put the 2 items, a tray and a mug, on the porch. A few minutes later, I heard a polite knock. I knew it was him and I ignored it. A few seconds later, a ring on the doorbell. Another ring, a louder knock. He kept ringing the doorbell over and over. Exasperated, I opened it and he stood there smiling. "Give me my mop and bucket." No. I quickly shut the door. Truth be told, I was worried he would try to stick his foot in the door and try to stop me from closing it, but he didn't move. He started knocking again, and ringing the doorbell repeatedly. At first, it was with some time in between, a few seconds, but it grew in frequency and volume. It went from firm knocking to louder, angry knocking. It felt like I was running a marathon, my heart was beating so fast. Since he started up straight up pounding on the door so hard that I could see it move, literally screaming, "Give me my stuff," over and over at the top of his lungs. After about 2 or 3 minutes of him being aggressive in doing this, I can assure you it felt like hours. He stopped and I heard this weird metallic scraping sound, like metal on concrete, accompanied by a grunt, followed by a loud metallic clang, and then silence. I waited for a while. I stealthily looked through the windows and didn't see him. I opened the door and to my surprise, saw that he had pulled my mailbox off the wall and thrown it onto the path leading to the sidewalk. I kicked myself for not filming the incident, but took my sweet time taking the perfect picture to show that he had made some kind of attempt to destroy the property. I mean, not much that I can do. It felt like the right thing to do, nonetheless, and I still have it. I ended up putting the mop and bucket outside and telling Kareem to come get it, and I just wanted to leave me alone. I even took out the battery of our door code since a part of me is paranoid it would try to guess it and break in. He came by and took it, and I watched him leave from the window. He hasn't contacted me since. I saw him on the street the other day and he gave me a warm smile as if we were friends, but I looked away and crossed to the other side to avoid him. I filed a police report of the incident the same day, as advised by my landlord. She told me during our phone call that he had a documented history of aggression, and I'm not shocked. I'm surprised she gave me the benefit of the doubt though, and let him sign the lease in the first place. I guess this was a learning experience for us all. When I asked her of her honest opinion of my new housemates, she said they were trustworthy. Plus, it turns out that the guys and I have a mutual buddy, so I'm not scared of them. I told them about the whole incident and they blocked him on Facebook. They were super supportive and I'm glad that I filed a report. They know who he is and they won't let him inside. The thing that freaks me out a little is that he moved down the street. I can see his new unit from my window. I can't really say let's not meet again since we live so close and we'll inevitably cross paths on the street in the future. But I can confidently and without hesitation say, Kareem, get effed. Hey everyone, I hope this is a good sub to post this in. I posted elsewhere and someone suggested posting here. In this particular crime, the perpetrator is thankfully behind bars, but I still struggle with the why of it all. So, my part of the story starts in 2009, and I was a junior in high school. I lived in a small town in Ohio. In the fall, I started to date my first real boyfriend, John. John was a senior and many of his friends were dating my friends, and he was well liked and funny at school. I'm thrilled about the relationship, especially because my strict parents seemed to like John as well. He's pretty quiet around them, but always polite and appreciative in their presence. Since it's a small town, John lived literally down the street, and we hung out all the time. My parents are actually getting divorced at the time, so I liked spending time at his place more than mine. John lived with Chris, a man who wasn't his biological dad, but someone that he had lived with since he was around 13, and he often called his dad. Chris was an adolescence counselor who knew John because he had been in foster care, and he had taken John in. Chris was an amazing human who was fun to be around, and it was just the two of them and their dog, Murphy, at the house. I didn't know much about John's childhood at first, other than it had clearly been rough enough for him to be involved with child services. Anyways, we spent a lot of time together, and always had a good time with Chris as well. Eventually, John confided in me that he often had pretty bad thoughts. I was shocked by this, and I told Chris about it as well. And we continued to date, and I did my best to support him. So, the next year, I'm a senior and John has graduated. but he's not really doing anything. He didn't go to college and his plans to join the military weren't working out. So he was living with Chris and was working a part-time job that my dad had gotten for him. I've always been into school and extracurriculars, and I felt like John was holding me back. Our relationship was going downhill in many ways, but I was scared that if I broke it off, John might really hurt himself. He had threatened to do so when I tried in the past. In May 2011, I graduated high school and decided I have had to leave the relationship behind. I was having my own depression issues, and John was having a detrimental effect on my mental health. I finally told him that we had to break up, and he needed to stop contacting me, threatening self-harm. I mostly cut off contact, and a couple of months later, I got an apartment with a friend about 30 minutes away from home and beside the college that I was attending. One Friday night in April 2012, I'm in my hometown to see a friend, and I pass John's house where I see police cars everywhere. I'm shocked and I assume the worst about John, so I immediately call our mutual friend Kyle. Kyle has no clue what's going on with John, and he says that John had hung out at his house the day before. Kyle said that John seemed like he was in a good mood, especially because he was driving Chris's Beamer at the time, which he loved to do. Anyways, Kyle was actually chilling in my apartment with my roommate. This is normal because he had a crush on her, so I just kept driving that way. When I got to my place, Kyle hadn't heard anything, but my mom calls me with the scoop. She's friends with the cops' wives. It's small town stuff. It turns out that John had killed Chris and was on the run somewhere. Someone had called for a wellness check after not hearing from Chris for a while, and the cops found his body at home. I was shocked and a little scared, as were Kyle and my roommates, so we all decided to stay at my roommate's parents' house for the night. By morning, the cops had luckily found and arrested John. He had taken the Beamer, so it was easily spotted at a rundown motel about 15 miles from his home, about 12 miles from our apartment. When the details came out, the whole thing was even more horrifying. It was a brutal act, and it had occurred days before the body was found, which meant that John was just hanging out at Kyle's house between committing this act and getting arrested, just nonchalantly playing video games, telling jokes to Kyle's little sister, acting like everything was fine. Meanwhile, he had stuffed Chris's body in their freezer at home. It's insane to think about how someone could be such a psychopath, and there was really no explanation given. John initially tried to plead insanity, but he was eventually deemed competent and then pleaded guilty. He got 30 to life in prison. I've obviously told this story from my perspective, but the person who really matters in this is, of course, the victim. Chris was truly a saint of a human being. He had been my role model for so many years, and you just wonder how could something so horrific happen to someone so good? And at the hands of someone that they had given everything to, someone they had loved, trusted, and seen as a son. It's horrifying. Chris spent his life advocating for kids like John, and the local center he worked at is actually named after him now, as is the street that it is on. As I said to begin with, I often wonder about the why of it all. Chris and John got along almost all the time, and though John clearly had mental health issues, no one thought that he would hurt anyone but himself. But clearly something was very wrong with John that we had missed. They say hindsight is 20/20, and I can definitely look back and think of a few strange instances with John. Sneaky, manipulative, and angry. He eventually showed all of those traits, but I was lucky enough not to experience any violence at his hands. I wish I could say the same for Chris. I'm thankful for the time I did spend with him, and the positive impact he had on my life during that time. I know that he had a positive effect on so many other lives as well. May he rest in peace. At the age of 12, I started babysitting for family friends who had 3 daughters, ages 4 to 7. They lived in a cul-de-sac where nearly every home housed a young couple, with children in the local elementary school. The neighborhood was extremely close-knit, like the 1950s American Block Party communities. They had a communal policy on using one another's toys. Any kid could use a play structure in someone else's yard anytime without asking. Shortly after, I started working in the neighborhood. They revised the rule to anytime a family is not using a babysitter to watch their kids, to ensure that I would not get overwhelmed supervising a swarm of kids I wasn't paid to watch. It was thus more or less known when parents were going out and leaving someone else in charge of their children. I was welcome to take the girls to play in any other yard as they wanted. Their parents even gave me permission to let them play in someone else's yard or a sandbox independently if I needed a short break. Being an avid Babysitters Club reader, I didn't leave the girls outside unsupervised ever. I would wait until someone else wanted a water or a bathroom break, and then corral everyone inside temporarily. Similarly, when the girls wanted to play in the treehouse owned by an older couple a few doors up the street, I climbed up despite a slight fear of heights and crouched in the little house with them, despite feelings of claustrophobia to follow my own rule. I don't recall whether my everyone inside, everyone outside together rule preceded the first odd interaction I had with the immediate next-door neighbor or not. But when the police questioned the girls that I babysat years later, they said nothing bad ever happened when I watched them, because I had set up that weird, sometimes annoying rule. One day while playing basketball with the girls in the driveway, the next-door neighbor came outside in a baseball cap and sunglasses and sat down on his second-story deck to read a paperback. I later noticed that he had turned his chair around 180 degrees to face us and the basketball hoop. I couldn't tell if he was looking at us. He had no reaction to me staring at him, flipping pages in the book like someone when they're reading. This behavior repeated every time we played basketball for the 5 years that I watched the girls. Eventually, once I had noticed him in the chair, accessories on, I would suggest a game we could play inside or in the front yard, but out of view. The strange neighbor was familiar to me as he went to my local church. I have never seen someone kneel in a pew, head bowed and hands folded, with the same level of intensity before or since. Once when my family was seated behind him, the priest came over to ask me to lead the children's mass during the homily because the usual person was out sick. This guy turned around and glared at me like I personally set out to interrupt his prayer time. When I worked in the church's nursery during various masses, I would often make eye contact with him as he waited in line outside the nursery door to use the restroom. From what I gleaned from our family friends and other people in the neighborhood, the odd basketball observer was a nice guy who gave up his apartment and job in the city to move in with and care for his sick, elderly mother. Since everyone thought he was so great, and since he went to church, this was before the Catholic sex scandal had broke out, I figured I was in the wrong for finding him creepy. Even as a young 12-year-old, I was used to guys in their 40s and 50s asking me to go somewhere with them, or driving by slowly as I walked, biked, jogged to make lewd comments. I figured I was projecting those experiences onto this awkward, quiet guy who wasn't doing anything wrong. For instance, I was certain that if the guy next door was a creep, he would not miss the opportunity to watch with his sunglasses on and book in hand while the kids and I went swimming each summer when the family opened their above-ground pool. But he never set foot out on his deck when the kids and I donned swimsuits to play in the pool or the backyard. I was more convinced I was conceited and mean. That's when I was 15 or 16. I caught him looking in the window as I cleaned up after movie night. The girls and I had put on a film after bath time, and instead of watching it theater style in total darkness, we kept some lights on so I could braid the girls' hair. The big screen TV we used for movies was located in an addition on the house with floor-to-ceiling windows. Though my parents were OCD about shutting blinds and curtains when the sun went down to prevent people from seeing in, our family friends had no window treatments on the big, modern windows. When I turned off the last light in the room, a floor lamp right next to a window facing the neighbor's house. I could see into the darkness outside where that weird man sat on his deck in a chair, in line with the window I was looking through. I looked over my shoulder and realized that he had a line of sight on where the girls and I sat on the floor during the movie. As I looked back towards the house, I glimpsed him hustling inside. I would have doubted I would see him at all if he had not left the chair in an unusual spot. After watching him turn the chair around to read during many a basketball match, I knew where the chair sat that night, facing the window into the family room. It was not the chair's usual position on the deck. After that incident, I would suggest playing board games in another room, or insist on watching movies at theater style, to ensure that he could not peep on what we did at night. Once the girls were asleep, I avoided the family room entirely because I was paranoid about being watched. If I wasn't in the kitchen doing homework or reading, away from all windows, I would walk around the original first floor footprint of the house, where all the windows had curtains. The first time the parents noticed my change in routine, they insisted I could watch TV or movies in the family room. I didn't mention anything to them because I was worried my concerns were silly and conceited. When I was 17, my family heard an evening cable news story about a man in our town caught in a police sting operation, in which a woman pretended to offer up her 2-year-old. When they raided his house, the police found a ton of horrible things on his computer. Our family friends called a couple of weeks later. They wanted to know how I knew the young man next door to them was not safe. He was the guy that I had heard about on TV. As they described it, the police found his blog where he wrote about his obsession with one of the girls who lived next door to him. It detailed his fantasies involving her and his plans to act on them. Things like lying in the treehouse for hours, hoping to corner her when she climbed up alone to play. Many of his entries focused on taking advantage of or kidnapping the girl, while the babysitter was in charge. In his head, babysitters were like the ones in old movies, talking to friends on the phone or making out with a boy they invited over, instead of caring for the children. As it became clear that I did neither of those things, his plans evolved to killing the babysitter, taking the girl, and getting out of Dodge. After talking to the girls to ensure that they were not victims, the police suggested that I might know something to have acted the way that I did. All the pieces, the frequent run-ins at church when I had children in my care, or the weird things that he did when he knew I was watching the kids next door, all fit together cohesively. I was relieved I was not mean-spirited or imagining things. I was perhaps conceited. The focus was not on me but on the children. But I was not crazy. Several years ago, I worked at a crisis unit for the acutely mentally ill. It was a 10-bed unit where individuals would come to stay as a step-down from a psychiatric hospitalization, or a diversion to prevent psychiatric hospitalization. I often worked alone on the weekends. One Friday evening, we had received an admission, Michael. Background info was provided with the referral indicating a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder and recent release from prison after serving a sentence for murder. I completed the initial intake meeting with Michael, during which time he had said some inappropriate things to me. I made it clear that that was inappropriate and that confidentiality was limited, and that the staff working on the unit as part of his treatment team would be privy to anything said in the interview or subsequent one-on-one sessions. He responded well to the redirection, and we finished the intake. And I went about the rest of my shift until about 11 p.m. that night, when he had approached the office and asked if I was working alone. Luckily at the time, I wasn't alone, and I told him that my male coworker was in the adjoining office. After this encounter, I explained the situation to my coworker, who read my shift summary and decided to sit down with Michael and tell him the way he was acting was not acceptable and that he could risk being released from the program if it continued. The next morning, I was working alone from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Around 9 a.m., I went to wake up another client, Jeremy, to administer his medications. The room Jeremy was assigned to was at the end of the hallway, and he was usually slow to get up in the mornings. While I was knocking on Jeremy's door, Michael approached me to tell me that he didn't appreciate that I'd shared the things he said to me with my male coworker. I explained to Michael that he knew what he said was inappropriate, and that he knew anything he said to me would be shared with the rest of the treatment team. Michael became more agitated and got on my face, backing me into the corner in front of Jeremy's bedroom door. At this point, Jeremy had woken up and heard what was happening outside his room. Jeremy came out of his room, stood between Michael and myself, and told Michael that he needed to walk away and calm down. Michael went back to his room, and I contacted my supervisor, who told me to document the encounter and continue my shift. Needless to say, I left that job shortly after this incident. I am thankful for Jeremy and that he had the presence of mind, while also being a client with a mental illness, to intervene on my behalf. I often wonder what would have happened if Jeremy wouldn't have woken up, or if he would have been in a more severe state of mental illness and would have become agitated as well. Update. For those saying I couldn't possibly have worked by myself in a 10-bed unit, it was not a secure unit. It was a voluntary unit and was never intended for violent individuals. Michael should have never been there. He needed a higher level of care than what we could provide. But to get funding, we needed beds filled. I was a bachelor's level MH worker. I administered medications, facilitated psychoeducational groups, and completed one-on-one sessions with clients every shift. I shouldn't have to work alone, but I did. I don't know if it was legal, and I'm assuming it is in my state, but I have no idea. Protocol was to call 911 if things got out of hand, and if they were really bad, to petition for involuntary hospitalization of the individual. Weekdays, there were 2 staff and a supervisor present. Evenings, there were sometimes 2 staff members, depending on the day of the week. Overnights, there was 1 staff, and on the weekends, it was me by myself, until the cooking or cleaning person came for roughly a half hour each. It wasn't an ideal situation, but it is common in residential homes for individuals with intellectual disabilities, and some personal care homes where I'm from. I had found some cheap train tickets to Luxembourg, and being the adventurous person I am, I decided last minute to book them and go all by myself. Due to some unfortunate, lack of planning on my part, circumstances, I ended up on that train to Luxembourg with nothing to wear for the weekend, except the clothes on my back. I figured it wasn't a big deal. How boring it would be to have everything go according to plan for once. But anyways, Luxembourg City is quite small, and after 2 days, I had pretty much seen all of what I wanted to see. A quick Google search showed me that there was a beautiful forest some kilometers north of the city. I thought that it looked perfect, so I bought a day train pass and set out on my journey. I managed to make it there, and it was absolutely gorgeous. I wasn't really dressed for hiking since I had no clothes or shoes with me at the time, but I didn't want to miss out on such an amazing experience, so I ventured into the forest anyways. I was wearing shorts and a t-shirt and ballet flats for shoes. I told myself that I would stay close to the area where the buses and cars park, and not to do any crazy rock climbing or anything, and nothing would go wrong. Boy, was that a dumb assumption to make. I was about 45 minutes away from where I started walking. There was no one else around. I walk along a sharp turn, and there's a lady heading towards me. She was around 45 or so, seemed quite plain. As we approached each other, she suddenly says, "That's not okay." I ignore this as I try to ignore people on the street as much as I can, and I keep walking. She has reached the point of being right next to me now, and as she passes, she says, "You can't do this." There is no one else around, so she had to be talking to me. I reluctantly turn towards her and ask, "Pardon me?" She says, "How dare you show up here like this?" I'm thinking that she has me confused with someone else, and I try to tell her that she's got the wrong person, and slowly keep walking. But she turns towards me and says, "This forest is sacred. You can't come in here wearing shoes like that." At this point, I'm stopped staring at this woman, confused as hell. I offer an apology and I keep going, but she follows me. She says, "You don't understand. You're ruining it." I say nothing. What the hell am I supposed to say? I see some big branches close by that I could maybe use as a weapon, if I had to. I don't even know what's going on at this point. She was screaming now, repeating, "It is sacred and my shoes are ruining the sacredness of the forest." But I stand my ground and offer one more apology. She tells me that I'm going to regret it. I don't know why, but I told her that I had nothing else to wear, trying to justify myself, I guess. And then she tells me that it doesn't matter. I'm starting to feel relieved. Maybe she'll leave me alone now. She says, "The forest is protected. Do you know who protects it?" I respond, "No." Realistically, where could I run? Nowhere. Who could I call? No one. So I have to face this lady at all times, and I don't want her attacking me from behind or something. She proceeds to tell me that Jesus Christ himself is protecting the forest. I nod. It sounds about right. She repeats that it doesn't matter to her anymore that I'm wearing ballet flats. She then says that Jesus and God know, since she told them. She tells me that God will not let me leave the forest. I say something along the lines of, "Pardon?" And she tells me slowly that God knows I have forsaken this forest and that I'm a traitor and a sinner. She tells me that I'm not going to make it out of this forest. "You will never leave. God won't let you. He sees you here, ruining the sacredness of the forest. He sent me to find you. You had your chance. He will give you the punishment that you deserve." I nod. I'm kind of scared, but at least she has left it up to God to punish me, so I should be okay. I just need her to walk away. We hold eye contact for about 45 seconds, and then she turns and continues on. I stay where I am, slowly back up into a tree and wait while I watch her leave. I was afraid that she had some nearby friends, so I wanted my back up to something. It made me feel safer. She was still within earshot, and she said, "He won't let you know. Nothing you can do will change you." She kept walking and never turned back. I waited 15 minutes and with my back in the tree, and then slowly kept going. I never saw her again, thank God. A long-time lurker, so I figured I would share my story. I was living in Tbilisi a few years ago, the capital of the Republic of Georgia, running a kind of legally ambiguous consumer credit operation, when I figured it was time I took a much-needed weekend getaway in a nearby small town. The town that I settled on is an extremely popular tourist location, given its beautiful location along a river nestled in a deep valley, and rife with ancient churches. With many options for potential guest houses, hotels and rentals, I decided to not book in advance, and to just trapeze around until I found something appropriate. I found a very adequate guest house perched on a hill with about a 1-acre plot. Upon entering the guest house, I was greeted in typical Georgian fashion by an incredibly hospitable woman, in her 60s between 90s, and her son who was in his early 30s who resumed his yard work of filling a large holy set with a septic tank, with a foul-ingrained smell after a brief introduction. Again, in typical Georgian fashion, the hostess offered me tea, homemade wine, bread and cheese, all of which were much needed and fantastic. I'm an American, but my family came from Eastern Europe, so I speak Russian, as most Georgians do, so we were able to chat a lot. Our conversation progressed from basic get-to-know-you bits to more personal information, like whether I'm seeing anyone or who I'm dating, which does come up in surprising frequency when you meet sweet grandmothers who want you to meet their granddaughters. At the time, I was dating a fellow expat from a Western European country. When I told the hostess that I was seeing someone, she seemed thrilled and asked me to show her a photo. She reacted with an ah and nodded in approval, commenting on her physique in a way that would probably be inappropriate if it wasn't a cute old grandma. I was then pressed by the hostess as to why I didn't invite her, and how that it isn't what a good boyfriend would do. But on the spot like this, I lied and said that she was very busy with a work project. She wasn't, but would be arriving later in the evening, and didn't ask. The hostess was elated by this news and called over her son and asked me to show the photo of the girl that I was seeing. Early in our conversation, it was established that I do not speak in Georgian. The son saw the photo and affirmatively nodded and spoke in Georgian to the hostess, and then turned to me with a beaming smile and a thumbs up and said in English, "Very pretty, your lucky brother." He then in Russian asked if I'd texted her to invite her. I lied and said that I did text her, and reiterated that she would be arriving in a few hours. It was around 4 p.m. at the time in a beautiful golden hour glow that lit up the surrounding mountains and valley. The son said that he'll join us and asked if I liked cha-cha. Cha-cha is a very strong national liquor of Georgia, ranging from 30 to 75% alcohol content and made from distilled grapes. I'd become quite the savant of cha-cha, and despite some strange feelings about their fixation on the female visitor, I obliged. Cha-cha is not for the weak-hearted, but I was very used to consuming it at the time. I should have paid more notice to the very intentional placement of these shots that he filled for us, but I pushed those misgivings aside and had the shot after a very traditional toast. Around 20 minutes later, I felt exhausted and ill and excused myself to my room, saying that I needed a quick nap. Walking to my room, I knew something was amiss. As mentioned in the beginning, I was fronting a questionable business and I did have a firearm in my bag, and I made a mental note to take it and put it under my pillow. But as one can imagine, it isn't easy to remember things even on a short term when apparently drugged. Despite failing to collect my weapon, I did close my blinds as the afternoon sun was blaring into the room, and I wanted darkness. Passing out at around 4:30 p.m., I awoke to darkness at 4:45 a.m. with a raging headache. My window shades were partially opened, despite me closing them before passing out. They were opened with about 2 feet of space visible to the outside. My bags were not at the position that I had left them, and the television was on, and on high volume despite me never using it, and the door was only partially closed. I peered out the window and didn't see anything, so I quickly went to my bag, retrieved my firearm, and went to the bathroom, with the intention of calling my coworkers or a driver to pick me up. I had no cell service and no Wi-Fi, despite having perfectly fine reception the day prior. I went back to bed with the weapon under the pillow, with zero desire for inclination to fall back asleep. After an hour or so pretending to be asleep, I saw the sun peer through the window to get a look inside. At this point, I was certain it was not my imagination playing tricks on me, and that I was in trouble. I came out around sunrise to find both the hostess and her son sipping tea on the deck, and told the hostess that my girlfriend was arriving soon on a bus, and that I would bring her when it arrived. I grabbed my backpack and left my other bag to give the impression that I wasn't fleeing. I got service immediately after leaving the property, and called a partner to come pick me up. An old-school businessman who was floating the money that I had run the lending operation. With that, I told him the story, and he said that he would handle it. He did handle it. I still think about the foul-smelling hole that the son was digging. The last guess, maybe. Weeks later, I decided that it wasn't the place or business for me, and applied to law school on the other side of the world. When I was a little girl, I lived in an apartment complex with my mother. The entire complex consists of 2 buildings that sat side by side, less than 100 feet apart, with 4 2-bedroom flats upstairs and 2 downstairs. We lived downhill about 100 yards from a major 5-lane road, but you would never know due to the thick woods that bordered the complex on 3 sides. The last side was an area cut for power lines that ran next to our driveway, with a graveyard directly behind it. It should go without saying that this setup was a recipe for many childish shenanigans as well as creepy encounters. On the front side of the complex and along the power line side were thick blackberry brambles. They weren't quite as thick along the power line area, but in front of the apartment you couldn't stick your arm in without being torn apart by the thorns, and it was so thick that it was nearly impossible to push through. This is relevant later. I was the only young child that lived there full time, and all the neighbors were, to the best of my knowledge, fond of me. I was active in Girl Scouts, so when it was time to go around to all the neighbors for orders, then when they came in, I would get my little wagon and deliver them. Because my mother knew and trusted all of the neighbors, I would do this myself. The day this happened, I had taken my wagon to the other building to deliver cookies to some of my mother's friends and was walking back. I hadn't meant to stay as long as I did, but they had an aquarium that was fascinating to me. That day, my mother's friend's husband had bought some new fish, so I had spent about 45 minutes helping them pick out names. So when I began to walk back, dusk had fallen. I had walked about 7 steps off their porch when I got a bad feeling. Now, I understand that I'm an empath, and I have learned to listen to my intuition, but back then, I just thought that I had to poo bad. I stopped for a second to settle my stomach and I heard a noise. When I looked to the front of the apartment, where the blackberries were the most thick, initially, I couldn't see anything and I wanted to say he had flicked a lighter or something, almost like he was trying to purposely alert me of his presence. The second that I saw him, I froze. He had shoulder-length, stringy black hair, bad skin, and looked like a skeleton. He was so skinny. Knowing what I know now, I imagine that he was probably strung out. I realized when he knew that I saw him because his face split into a wicked, not at all friendly grin. Then he began tearing his way through the blackberry brambles towards me. I began running towards my house while screaming bloody murder as I heard his feet slap the pavement behind me. I got to my steps and my Uncle Mike, who lived next door, flung his door open to see what the heck was going on, but the man had disappeared. I began screaming and crying about the man that had chased me out of the woods, because Mike hadn't seen him. Initially, he had thought that I let my imagination run away with me, but when he looked at the area I said that he had emerged from, there was a clear path and blood from where he had been cut by the thorns. After they took their machete to cut away the brambles and investigate where he had came from, they discovered a small area he had been standing in, with a small pile of cigarette butts like he had stood there waiting for me when he saw me walk across initially. A few weeks later, deeper in the woods, my mother's boyfriend and I discovered a small tent with assorted, inappropriate paraphernalia. No one mentioned the connection, but I was very mature for my age, so when I thought about it, it disturbed me very much. So, disturbing stranger that departed your tent to watch me from the woods. Let's not meet again. I'm a university student now, but this incident happened when I was in 8th grade. When I was around 14, I studied a subject focusing on outdoor pursuits. For our final assessment, 2 teachers took my class on a one-night camp where we would do activities like rock climbing, kayaking, trail walking, and so on. I live in Australia, around an hour from a state forest that was notorious for the backpacker murders. Several bodies had been found and several more remain missing. I'm pretty sure all of the murders were linked to the same killer. Anyway, in the morning we leave the school and drive out in a bus. When we reach the road that leads to the entrance of the forest, a police car is parked outside. He spoke to the teacher for a moment, but I didn't hear anything and no one else seemed to notice or care. Fast forward a few hours and we've tracked about 20 of us to the camping area somewhere in the middle of a state forest. Some parts are state and some parts are privately owned, I think. While kayaking that afternoon, we noticed a helicopter doing flybys, but again, my classmates never suspected anything. A couple of mates and I were the first to leave the water and helped the teacher with some equipment and started building our own rafts. I was standing off to the side when one of the national park guides walked over to one of the instructors and talked in a hushed, slightly stressed out tone. I remembered hearing the instructor say stuff like, "You're kidding," and "I don't believe it." He just looked shocked and taken aback. So at this point, I started connecting the dots, but I didn't say anything to my school friends. Around dusk that night, I got to use the toilet block, which is around 100 meters from the main campsite. As I go in, I remember a guy walking around the other side of the block. I didn't see him very clearly in the diminished light, but he kept glancing around with nervous body language. I couldn't see his face clearly. He wasn't part of our party, and to me he just didn't fit. I didn't think much of it at the time though. Fast forward to the next morning when we got back to the car park. The teacher tells us that a body was found in a dam not far from where we were. They didn't want to tell us so as to not frighten us. We later found out that it was a young guy who was killed with an axe, and the guy who did it was related to the serial killer who hunted in the same area. I don't know if that guy I saw had anything at all to do with the murders, but it freaked me out a lot afterwards. I haven't been camping since. This happened to me when I was 17, around the time when most of my friends were just getting their driver's license. We all had that rush for cars back then, so it was quite common for us to skip school and go for a ride out of town. The city where I live is surrounded by forests and 2 mountains, so we basically had a lot of places to go and chill. One day, my friend was very excited to show us a place that he had found about online, and possibly here on Reddit, for which people said was quite odd. We looked it up and apparently it had a reputation for being a paranormal site. Being the typical group of teens, we collectively agreed to check it out ASAP, including me who more or less believes in spiritual stuff. Going up the mountain, we were listening to the radio until we lost the station to static, which for obvious reasons is what the radio does when you go deep into the woods. This entire experience is happening during a summer night, so we were feeling pretty careless and as excited as a person can be. Having no music to listen to, we started talking and discussing our expectations for this place, with most of us having no expectations at all. Our conversation was suddenly interrupted by the loud static coming from the radio that we had just turned off a few minutes ago. We were all a bit startled, but still nothing out of the ordinary. It happened again a few minutes later. We all looked at the radio and it was still off. We quickly dismissed this as something that radios do for some reason, and again didn't pay much attention. The third time that it happened, the driver hit the brakes and stopped the car. He turned to us and yelled, "Come on, did you hear that? What was that?" Claiming that he had heard a voice this time. None of us heard anything except the static. The driver said that he had had enough and switched the engine off, so there is no possible way for anything including the radio to be working. We all sat there like that for a while in pitch black, for there would be no city lights around us and the forest had covered all other light sources like stars and so on. You couldn't distinguish a night sky, that's how dark it was. The light indicating the radio turned down and soon, the static came again. I could tell that we were all feeling a bit anxious by then. Through the static came a female voice singing and it was very silent. For a second it got louder and then fell back to silent again and then vanished. But even weirder, the static vanished too. Once we switched the car back on and turned the headlights on too, we observed what seemed to be smudges of fingers all across the windshield. We didn't turn the car around immediately, but I could tell that we all just wanted to leave. We stopped further up on the hill, took some pictures of the Milky Way, and went home afterward. Ever since, we speculate about what the heck happened to the radio in the windshield that night. My friends went 2 more times without me to the same place, recording the same, including feeling a small push once the car was off. What do you guys think? I believe there are many logical explanations, but considering the fact that I'm somewhat of a person who believes in such stuff, and I had an adrenaline rush that night, it's hard for me to grasp something rational. My friend Sally has had a bad run-in with neighbors, but this one was the worst. Sally lives very close to me, about a 10-minute walk. We were both around 14 when this happened. We live in a rural area, so we both have a lot of land. So, with nothing else to do, Sally and I decided to go camping on her land. We bought cheap hammocks and went through the bushland. The days prior, we spent clearing some of the razor grass with a cane knife to make a path. We probably should have worn long pants because we ended up with little cuts all over our legs and some on our arms. We set up a few hammocks and brought quite a few blankets because it was getting pretty cold at night, even though we were sweating throughout the day. We were still on our property and hadn't gone to her neighbor's boundary. Her neighbor had just leased the land to some new tenants. Sally and I were sitting in our hammocks talking and laughing, and it was around 9 p.m. We heard something in the bush. We just thought that it was a wallaby. There are plenty of wallabies around here. But then we could see a figure of a man. We were whispering to each other, trying to see who it was. At first, we thought that it was her brother. He had come out and scared us when we were camping previously. But then as the person got closer, we were thinking that it could have been her dad. It was dark and the bush looks the same from every angle. We realized the man was coming from the other direction that wasn't from her house. We didn't dare move and covered our torches under our blankets. The man came up and said hi and introduced himself as Ben. Now Ben was extremely drunk and he staggered around and he reeked of alcohol. He started saying how we had a nice little camp here and said something pretty unsettling. I'll have to come out and sunbake naked here on one of these hammocks. Me and Sally gave each other worried looks but didn't say anything. It only got worse from here. I can't remember everything he said because it was a while ago, and he was mumbling on for what felt like forever. But some of the things just stuck out. I'll have to kill you, Wolf Creek style. And he said, you're nearly legal then, when he asked about her age. Ben was probably in his 40s. Sally and I were texting each other while he was talking and coming up with an escape plan. He also offered us a puff on the magic dragon and pulled out a glass pipe. We declined. Sally said that we were leaving back to our house to make food. He told us to come back. We left our blankets and most of our stuff there and we liked it. We told her dad what had happened and we slept inside. The next morning, we went back to our campsite to find everything burnt. A circle with probably about a 20-meter radius was all burnt. And coming from that circle was a line of burnt grass, going towards the neighbor's house. I'm not a firefighter or do forensics, but it seemed obvious that some kind of fuel was used. Sally and I were talking and it dawned on us the possibility that Ben may have thought that we were in the hammocks due to the pile of blankets. Ben was definitely drunk enough not to be able to tell the difference. We went and told Sally's dad, who then checked it out and then went next door. Ben's roommate answered the door and said that Ben wasn't home and apologized, and even gave Sally's dad $50 for the blankets and hammocks. Nothing more happened for a few months. Sally told me at school about how Ben had been caught on camera sneaking around her yard. I went to her house after school because she was going to be home alone until her dad finished work. I ended up sleeping over there that night, and that's when he came over. Ben was drunk and came out the front of Sally's house and started yelling that he had accused Sally of stealing his dog. Sally's dad called the police, and they arrested him. The next day, we found a knife in the yard, and it wasn't from Sally's house. The police came again, and we told them about the knife, and they got the footage from the cameras as well. I don't know what happened to Ben, but he no longer lives next to Sally. Okay, so this happened when I was around 9 years old. I'm 25 now, and it's something that I will never forget. It gives me goosebumps to this day. I live in a terraced house. It's 4 houses combined, and my neighbors and I each have our own little patio. There's a small road 10 meters from my yard where people do their Sunday walks and so on. Only a small fence separates my small yard and patio from that road. I live in a pretty crowded area, with several of those terraced houses spread across to my neighborhood. So seeing people walking on that road is pretty normal for me. Seeing random people standing on my patio is not. When I was 9, I usually got home from school about an hour before my mom got home from work. I lived maybe 10 meters away from school, so my mom figured I was mature enough to be home alone for around an hour before she got home. This one day that I got home from school, I did the usual thing, which was to make sure I locked the front door and double-check that the back door leading to the patio was also locked. I was 9. Being alone was a little scary, even though it was in the middle of the day and only for an hour. I then would rush to my room upstairs to play as much PlayStation as possible before my mom came home and made me do homework. While playing, I heard this noise coming from outside my window. My room was located 1 floor above the patio, with a view to the road that I told you about before. It was kind of like the sound of a cat, but my cat had been missing for over 3 months. Hope sparked, and I thought, did she finally come back? I ran downstairs to check if it was my cat, but the sight that met me gives me goosebumps just writing this. There's a guy standing on my patio, a tall guy with black hair covering half of his eyes, making him look like a male version of the Ring woman or something. I could hear him making high-pitched sounds, almost like a cat meowing. A brown liquid was running down from his mouth, and I could see him spitting out my dad's stopped cigarettes. He was actually eating from the ashtray. I was frozen observing this. Eventually snapped out of it and screamed so loud that the man must have heard it. He didn't react. He kept on eating from the ashtray. I ran upstairs to my room, locked the door, and called my mom, who then called the cops. I've never been more terrified in my life. Laying in bed under my sheets, shivering with fear, as I hear these creepy, high-pitched noises from the guy eating cigarette stumps from the ashtray on my patio. I kind of blacked out for a moment, because the next thing I remember is the police arriving on the road by my yard. I hear them talking to the guy, saying stuff like, "What are you doing? Get over here, or we'll come down and arrest you," and so on. He didn't respond, but the high-pitched sounds were more frequent and louder. I decided to look through the window, feeling safe now that the cops were there. I could see 2 police officers standing by my fence, 1 man and a woman. I did not see the creepy man, however, because he was standing directly 1 story under me and out of my field of view. The police jumped the fence, and I remember hearing the creepy guy screaming louder than anything I'd ever heard before. He charged the female police officer with full force, and he knocked her out cold. The male officer then immediately tased the guy, leaving him shaking on the ground, screaming still. The policeman struggled to keep him on the ground while putting handcuffs on him, but eventually he made it. After a while, he had managed to wake up the female officer, who seemed to be badly hurt, He called for backup in an ambulance, and then he sees me standing in the window above him. The expression on my face must have been something else, because he just looked at me and said, "I sure as hell hope you didn't see all that." And I started to cry. By this time, neighbors started to arrive wondering what the hell was going on. One of my neighbors, an elderly woman, made me come down and she took care of me until my mom came back home. The police took the creepy guy with them in the car and they eventually left. Before they left, they promised to come back and talk to us about what had happened. This is where the story takes an unexpected turn. The male police officer came back later that night and sat down with me and my mom to talk. He explained that the guy on my patio was actually diagnosed with severe autism. He had escaped a facility where mentally challenged people live, located around 5 kilometers from where I live. He explained that the guy had actually been living in my house 5 years ago, but he had been forced to move when his mom, his only caretaker, had died. The poor guy probably thought he would find his mom in my house. He missed the routines and he missed living there with his mom. The police had to move him from the house that time 5 years ago because he was extremely strong. From what I heard, he had extreme tensions in the body because of the autism, making his muscles grow stronger and stronger throughout the years. This was the reason he had reacted the way he did when the police came this day. Still frightened, I told the police officer that he needed to make sure this would never happen again, and he promised that it wouldn't. After a few sleepless nights, my life got back to normal. The years went by and the guy didn't come back, until 1 year ago. At this time, my mom and dad had moved out and I had bought the house from them, and I'm still living there today. I was enjoying my morning coffee on the patio when I see this random guy stopping on the road by my fence. He just stands there looking at me. I look at him and I give him a nod. And then I hear the high-pitched noises. Holy crap, it's him. His hair had turned gray, but the high-pitched noises made me realize. My heart started racing and I instantly remembered the reason why he was back. I realized that he must have managed to get out again. Because I kept my cool a bit longer than when I was 9, I started to realize how sorry I felt for the guy. 16 years later and he was back to look for his mom. I decided to carefully ask him if he wanted to come down to the patio. He instantly jumped the fence. I started to think that he would knock me out like he did to that police officer. He didn't. He smiled and he looked at me and smiled. I offered him to sit down. He didn't respond. I offered him to come inside. He started laughing. We went inside and his face lit up with pure joy. He was home. It reminded him of the life he had with his mom. It almost made me tear up. All of a sudden, he sat down on my couch, turned on my TV, and switched directly to the cartoons. I observed him for a while. He was just completely focused on the cartoons. I just wanted him to enjoy the moment, so I didn't say anything to him. But I realized that I had to call the facility to let them know, and the caretakers arrived 10 minutes later. After a lot of convincing, he got back up crying, and they went back to the facility. I called the facility 2 days later, and we made a deal. His name is Tom, and I now consider Tom my friend. Every Sunday from the day that he returned, Tom and his caretakers visit me to watch cartoons. They say that it's the highlight of his week, and it makes my heart warm. Now, for several years, my thoughts were, let's not meet. Guy on my patio eating from the ashtray. But now my thoughts are, let's meet every Sunday to watch cartoons. My friend Tom. Several years ago, when I was 25, I lived with, at the time, one of my best friends. Our friendship eventually started to dwindle, as it usually goes when you move in with a good friend, so she was rarely home. This night, however, she ended up staying at her place, heading to bed early. I was a server at the time, so I stayed up pretty late, usually watching YouTube and smoking pot. This night was no different than any other, except for the fact that my neighbors had tried to kidnap me. I'll go ahead and give some background info on my house and my neighbors. We lived in a 3-bedroom house with 2 bedrooms and the kitchen facing the crazy neighbors. They were a younger couple living in a smaller mill house. They were constantly coming out to our door asking for handouts. Now normally, I would be happy to help out a neighbor, but they would come over and ask for crazy stuff, like us to fill up an old Mountain Dew bottle with water, because theirs got shut off, beer, and once literally to ask for a single dollar. They would constantly be knocking at our door to ask for help, and when we wouldn't answer, I'd peek through the window to see them either jacking cigarette butts from the ashtray or pressing their eyeballs against the door people to see if they could spot us. Anyway, there I was smoking some weed and watching YouTube on my couch when I heard a knock at the door. I rolled my eyes because I knew exactly who was knocking. It was 11 p.m. I checked the people and sure enough, the boyfriend was on my porch. Normally, I would just walk away and continue with my life, but he looked like he was in distress. I opened the door up to see what was up. Hey, I just wanted to come over here and see if you would film my engagement. I got my girlfriend a ring here in my pocket and I need you to follow me to my backyard and film it for me. Baffled but curious, I told him congrats and that I would be out in a second. I just needed to put shoes on. I shut the door behind me and locked it. And quickly, I ran to the back room that looked out into their backyard. I peeked through the blinds to see the setup. Nothing. Pitch black darkness. No signs of decorations or anything like that. Naturally, I woke my roommate up and told her what was going on. Yeah, forget that, she said to me, and we both walked back up to the door after the boyfriend had started banging on it. I looked through the peephole again. I couldn't see anything and was confused all the way up until he pulled his eyeball away from the peephole. I quickly turned around and put my back up against the door. My roommate came running back to the door from her room, manning 2 wire hangers for protection. We both clung onto the hangers and sat up against the door until he finally left. We were so freaked out, but we wanted to make sure that we weren't overreacting. We went out to our back door and hopped into her car so we could do a drive-by. And they always had their front door open and also didn't have any blinds, so it was easy to see inside of their house. Slowly, we crept by in her car and peered into the living room. Sitting on the couch and all staring at the wall, they looked strung out. It was the couple and an older man. We sped off and ended up staying at a friend's house that night. I never answered the door for either of them again. One day I came home from work and an older lady was parked in their driveway. She walked up to me and got out of the car and asked if I knew where the neighbors were. I told her that I hadn't seen them for a while and she informed me that she was the owner. She told me that they were months late on rent and finally came to evict them. She entered the home to find it completely trashed, needles and garbage everywhere, holes in the wall, and literal crap on the floor. I told her that I was sorry to hear that she had to deal with all that, but I was happy that they were finally gone. I'm not 100% sure what was going on that night, but I'm glad I didn't follow him into the backyard. It was an early summer morning and the sun was up, but few people were out. In fact, these streets were practically dead that morning. My mom decided to take my sister, only 1-year-old at the time, seated in a stroller, and I, to throw away some garbage at the garbage station. I might add that the garbage station is kind of secluded from nearby houses, bordering one of those deep, dark forests of eastern Sweden. Since I was only 4 when this happened, the memories from the incident had faded a lot. However, my mom remembers all of it. She says that upon entering the station, she immediately got an eerie feeling of being watched. I remember that feeling too. I felt creeped out, even though I didn't know why I was scared. I guess I could sense my mom's fear. Walking along that secluded garbage station, my mom suddenly stopped and told me this. Hold onto the stroller as hard as you can and don't let go, no matter what. That's my most vivid memory I have of this, and I don't think I'll ever forget those words. I'll at least never forget how they made me feel. It was as if my blood had turned to ice. I just froze. My mom sounded stern, but even a toddler can sense when someone's scared out of their mind. My mom was definitely afraid of something. The rest is just a blur. I don't remember much apart from the aforementioned, so I'll let the rest of the story be told from the perspective of my mother. This is the recollection of her experience, recalled to the best of my abilities, but in my own words. Not far from where we were standing, a truck was parked with a man seated in the front. Nothing unusual. A lot of truck drivers stopped to rest by the side of the road. But this man was staring, and he wouldn't stop staring. He stared right at me, examining my body with the determined gaze of a predator. Gluing the three of us in his sight, he truly seemed pleased by the fear he had instilled on our faces. And his eyes, they were something else, almost as if they didn't belong to a human, but rather to a predator on the savannah. I felt like prey, stuck in the claws of a lion, and I couldn't move. And that's when he smiled at me. I remember that dead smile, those cold, calculating eyes, and the way that he licked his lips, almost as if to say, I could kill you all if I wanted to. I believed this was the point in time, into this strange encounter, when my mom told me to hold on to the stroller, to hold on tightly and not let go. My mom is a small woman, 160 centimeters, weighing only about 48 kilograms, and she could easily have been overpowered by the overweight man in the truck. My mom later admitted she was afraid he would jump out of the truck and knock her out, possibly assaulting her, or even taking me and my younger sister. We bolted out of there. We didn't throw away much garbage that morning. We just turned around and walked home as quickly as my mom could do with a stroller and a 4-year-old toddler at her side. We never talked about what happened that day, up until very recently. The incident has always lingered somewhere in the back of my mind, as that weird thing that happened when I was a kid. And every time I walk past that garbage station, I get a weird feeling in the pit of my stomach. As previously mentioned, this happened around 2006. Fast forward to 2008. The face of a 10-year-old little girl called Engla was printed across the front page of every newspaper in sight. She had been kidnapped and murdered, and the perpetrator was an overweight truck driver named Anders Öcklund, now known as one of Sweden's most infamous killers. Anders Öcklund was charged with the murder of Engla, alongside the murder of a woman named Pernilla. And he's also suspected of abducting another little girl who's still currently missing, making him more than one thing. My mom says that when she saw Öcklund's picture in the paper, when she saw those cold, familiar eyes, she knew that he was the creepy man from the garbage station that early morning all those years ago. Thinking how my mom or my sister or me, or all of us could have been his victims, that sends chills up my spine. Anders, even though you're behind bars, let's never meet again.